Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is all roads lead to Denerim in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. 11 Conscription and Calming Drafts. He lied to me. By the maker, a bee blood mage. Lily muttered from somewhere nearby. I never. Khazar glared back at her in annoyance, pushing himself up into a sitting position from where he'd been sprawled. His right side hurt. He'd been knocked down pretty hard by the concussion Jowan had unleashed. That damn blast had wrenched his shoulder something awful, and he hadn't even been in front of it. Who knew blood magic could give such a mediocre mage raw power like that? And Jowan had had the gall to lie to him about it. Maker's breath. Is everyone all right? That was Knight Commander Grigor, apparently regaining his senses enough to sit up. The chamber was a mess. Nearly a dozen Templars were knocked out on the floor, though some were beginning to stir. First Enchanter Irving and some bearded stranger had gotten the brunt of the blast, and had been thrown halfway across the room by the force of it. Everything and everyone was covered in specks of Jowan's blood. Khazar peered over at the first Enchanter, relieved to notice that Irving seemed all right. The first Enchanter's favoritism was the only thing that kept everyone else from turning on him sometimes. Then, he spotted the figure kneeling over the first Enchanter, apparently checking on his injuries. Long black hair. Ink-spattered robes. Horse face. Felicity Amel. You. Khazar surged to his feet, magic pooling hot and vicious in his hands. He launched himself at the tower's resident know-it-all, intending to stuff a fireball down her nosy little throat, but a suit of heavy armor moved to block his path, and he simply ended up bouncing off a Templar chest plate. Not to be deterred, he shoved against Grigor's grip. To his credit, the Knight Commander held on to him, even though the air around the small mage crackled like an imminent storm. You brought them, didn't you? Khazar hissed at the woman, straining against the commander's firm grip on his shoulders. You were eavesdropping in the chapel, and then you ran and tattled to the Templars. The young woman stiffened, glaring at him with righteous indignation that only stoked Khazar's anger. I couldn't very well sit by and do nothing. You were going to destroy his phylactery, you did destroy his phylactery. And it was none of your business. He summoned a surge of fire, intending to blast the insufferable woman into charred little pieces with it, but Grigor grabbed him by the back of his neck and did something. Khazar felt all his magical energy rush out of him, along with a great deal of physical energy. Groaning, he sagged bonelessly in the Knight Commander's arms. Everyone calm down, the first Enchanter's voice said. We must think through this rationally. Irving finally sat up, rubbing his head. The bearded stranger nearby was already climbing to his feet. I knew it, Irving, Khazar heard Grigor growl. Blood magic. Now we have a blood mage on the loose and no way to track him down. And we have this one to thank for it. Khazar felt Grigor's hands tighten on his shoulders, but his head was spinning too much to do more than struggle feebly. Blast it, but Templar anti-mage skills were effective, weren't they? None of us expected this, Grigor. Irving climbed to his feet with the Amel woman's help. I did. I've been saying for years that this little menace should be made tranquil. Now he's aided the escape of a Maleficar. I submit that he and this young woman be sent to Eonar immediately. I will pay my penance, Lily said somewhere behind Khazar, causing a fresh spike of anger to shoot up his spine. I had no idea he was a blood mage. Khazar gave a wordless shriek of rage and tried again to break out of Grigor's steel grip. When that failed, he merely whirled on the woman as best he could and spat out, so much for love, huh. Lily flinched, but refused to meet his eyes, the coward. Find out the guy's a blood mage, and suddenly he's the inhuman scum of Thedas, is that it? You're nothing but a brainless, spineless chantry whore. Khazar, that is quite enough, Irving's voice cut in firmly. Khazar turned back to see the first Enchanter moving to stare down at him with weariness in his wizened eyes. Have you no regret for what you've done? You mean me helping a lifelong friend escape existing for the rest of his life as some empty, soulless thing? No, can't say I do. Grigor cried, he's a blood mage. He's a person. Kind of a dumb one, but he's not evil. Perhaps not now, Khazar, Irving said with a sigh. But blood magic corrupts. The Jowan you knew will have already started to disappear. Chantry propaganda. No, it's true, the know-it-all snitch piped up. There have been records of well-respected mages dabbling in the art, and then becoming more susceptible to demonic influence. It has to do with the way it drains the life force of the user, making resistance across the veil more difficult. And then when you factor in the mind control. Irving turned to her. Thank you, Felicity. But I do not believe he will listen to reason in this. Irving turned back to Khazar, his eyes, disappointed. Khazar froze, because that was an expression he didn't often see on the first enchanter's face. Not aimed at him. I am sorry, my boy, but you've left me no choice in this matter. Grigor, you may take them away. What? Khazar's world went hot again, but this time, the anger was accompanied by an emotion just as strong, fear. They're going to make me tranquil. Illegality be damned, I know they will. It is, for the best. The first enchanter looked defeated. But. Khazar's breath escaped him in panicked gasps, and he could feel the magic surging through him in response to his terror. But I'm the most talented mage of my generation. You've said so yourself. Lightning danced up and down his arms, despite Grigor's magic blocking grip. And it will be most regrettable to lose you. The old man's eyes were steady and resolute, and pitying. The pity was the worst part. The Knight Commander called for backup, and 2 other blood-splattered Templars stepped in to add their dispelling talents to the panicking elf. It felt like his magic was being covered in a heavy blanket, perhaps the last magic he would ever be afforded. Khazar shrieked as he felt them try to snuff him and surged with everything he had. Fire and lightning and wind gushed from him, the magic tearing at the leashes the Templars were attempting to construct. All 3 Templars stumbled back, and Khazar felt their leash snap, the magic vortex he'd conjured rushing out without restraint, fueled by fear. As terrified as he was, he couldn't find the wherewithal to control it, so the storm grew and threatened to consume all of them. And then Felicity stepped up to him through the torrent, her form sheathed in the white glow of a spell shield. He stumbled back from her, but she stepped in and grabbed his chin, then poured something from a vial down his throat. His fear ebbed away, and his magic with it. He felt completely drained, having pulled too much power from the Fate in too short a time. He was left gasping, standing powerless and vulnerable before those who would take away his humanity. Well done, Felicity, Irving said. He'd surrounded himself and the bearded stranger in a shield, which he now dispelled. Most laudable thinking. What did you give him? It's just calming draft. She waved a flask. I used to take it before important exams. Khazar felt Grigor's hands fall on his shoulders again, and he slumped, defeated. He couldn't fight back. Not as drained as he was, and not with what the Templars could do. We will use every means necessary to track down the Maleficar, the Knight Commander said. In the meantime, I will personally escort this mage and the girl to Eonar. So be it, Irving said, turning away. If I may speak, Commander, the bearded man said, stepping forward. He had watched the entire exchange with an assessing gaze. Khazar might have found it insulting, but he couldn't really muster the will to care at this point. This does not really concern you, Warden. Grigor snapped. I believe that it does. As the 2 of you know, I came to the tower seeking mages for the army, but I am also seeking recruits for the Grey Wardens. I believe I have found one. What? You're not talking about him. Grigor sounded like he honestly couldn't believe it. Khazar couldn't either. There is a blight upon us, Commander, and we need every advantage we can get. I believe that a mage of this boy's raw talent would go far in turning the tide against the Darkspawn. But, he aided a Maleficar. And in doing so has shown outstanding loyalty to his friend. Khazar stared at the Grey Warden, hardly believing what he was hearing. A new emotion sparked in his chest, hope. Yes, yes. Irving said, sounding like he was warming to the idea himself. That may just do. But what if he turns on you? Grigor spat out. This boy is volatile. He'd just as soon set you on fire as follow you. Much to everyone's surprise, most of all Khazar's, the warden turned to him. What do you say, Khazar Surana? If I take you from here and recruit you into the Grey Wardens, would you agree to work with me against the Blight? Khazar's chest was tight with gratitude. He tried to speak once and failed, then managed a squeaking, yes. There you have it. I will take this mage under my wing, and assume all responsibility for his further actions. In return, he will be an asset to Ferelden against the Darkspawn. Now listen here, Warden. Grigor released Khazar, just so he could place himself challengingly in the Warden's face. This mage is too dangerous to allow to dash. I will invoke the right of conscription, if necessary. Please, do not make me do so. Grigor sputtered, but stood down. After a moment, he barked at one of the other Templars to go fetch Khazar's things from his room. The underling left to do so. Irving turned back to Khazar, relief in his eyes. But still, Khazar couldn't shake the very recent memory of the first enchanter agreeing that Grigor should cart him off. So, when Irving took a step toward him, Khazar stepped back. The first enchanter sighed. It is good to know your talents will be put to such a use, though a pity it came about in such circumstances, Khazar. Warden, the Amel woman said, are you sure you can control him? If not, I can provide you with the recipe for my calming draft. That is a kind offer, Miss Amel. However, if you wish, I would prefer to have you with me instead. All heads turned. What was that, Duncan? Irving said. I had been considering recruiting Felicity here before this whole chain of events occurred. Duncan turned back to her. Irving spoke highly of you before, and judging by what I just saw, I must say he did not exaggerate. Amel's dark skin reddened. I am flattered, truly, but I must warn you that I am not nearly as powerful as you must think. Certainly nowhere near Khazar's dash. While power is an asset, the Grey Wardens need more than sheer force to stop the Blight. We need intelligence, resourcefulness, and the will to do what must be done for the safety of all. You, Miss Amel, have these qualities in spades. I would be honored to recruit you into the Wardens. Oh my, all the things I could learn. Yes, I'll join you. Irving sighed, and so I must lose two of my most promising mages in one day. It will be worth it, Irving, Duncan assured him, when their promise is turned on the Darkspawn. Yes, I know. He turned to say his farewells to Felicity, and Khazar used that chance to approach Duncan. You saved me. Duncan smiled down at him. Blast it, but the man was tall, even by human standards. The only thing I ask in return is that you fight the Darkspawn with me. Khazar nodded, still stunned. He didn't really know much about Darkspawn. The book-reading part of his studies had always been excruciatingly dull, but he saw no harm in turning his talents on them for a while. Not when the alternative was being made tranquil or worse, though Khazar couldn't really imagine what could be worse than being made tranquil. Not even death. He shivered, all too aware of just how close he'd gotten to that awful fate, if not for Duncan's intervention. The Templars returned shortly, bearing 2 bags instead of 1. One of those bags held all of Khazar's worldly possessions. That didn't include much, since most things in the tower were considered property of the tower. As far as the Templars were concerned, that included the mages themselves. The other mage's bag was a great deal heavier, since it included a tome stuffed with all the notes and herbal recipes the woman had apparently ever learned. Then, Khazar followed as Duncan led Felicity, Amel and himself out of the tower. The other mage was already chattering, asking Duncan obscure questions about Darkspawn. Khazar supposed he should listen and learn, but he couldn't really muster the will. His emotions were too churned up after everything that had just happened. When Duncan pushed through the huge doors that led outside the tower, he kept on going as if it wasn't a big deal. Felicity and Khazar, however, stopped at the threshold. The woman took a deep breath of the outside air, her face spreading into an exhilarated grin. Do you smell it? Its vastness, opening up before us? All the possibilities. Khazar didn't deign to respond to her. She had still snitched to the Templars about Jowen's plan, after all. Instead, he took 2 steps out the door and looked up at the place that had been his cage for the last 12 years. Hadn't he wanted to be free of it? So then why did the prospect of leaving it now make his stomach twist in anxiety? The tower was so tall. It seemed to look over all of Thedas, but really its view was so very, very small. No, he wouldn't be scared about this. He was glad he was leaving. No more holding back because it made the enchanters nervous. No more having to sit quietly for hours on end. No more run-ins with a certain enchanter who always made him want to scream and burn everything. No more blasted Templars, watching every little step, just waiting for the opportunity to run an innocent mage through. He was free of it all. Like an apostate in that he was free from circle rule, and yet he would never have to worry about the Templars trying to hunt him down for it. They could no longer touch him. In retrospect, this was the best thing that could have happened to him. Smirking, he turned away from his view of the tower. Duncan was waiting for them patiently down by the dock. Khazar headed down the worn path between them with a spring in his step. 12 winds of change. It's called a shell game, Marnan. Emmett bent over the table, shifting the 3 goblets where he had placed them face down. Under one of them was a glass marble. She frowned, perplexed. But how can it be a shell game? There are no shells. The other 2 wardens chuckled as they looked on. They were at the adjacent table, sampling the spoiled princess's wares. The group had been frittering away the day there while Duncan visited the mage tower in search of recruits. Thus far, Marnan only found the surface world more and more puzzling. It's not the shells that matter, said Emmett. But it's called a shell game, the exiled noble pressed. How can the shells not be important? There was a low rumbling chuckle near the door, and the last member of Duncan's band made himself known. Marnan whirled a glare at him, wondering how long the duster had been lurking there. He had a habit of doing that, lurking. It was something about the way his coloring made him fade into the shadows. Maybe the term shell is saying how thick the mark's skull has to be to fall for it, the casteless said with a smirk. He strode up to the table, giving Marnan a grin that was sharper than any sword. You ever fall for one, princess? I resent the implication, Brand. I would challenge you to a duel of honor, except you obviously don't have any. He laughed, and even that seethed with hostility, a sentiment she entirely returned. And now neither do you. He reached over the table and started moving the goblets around one another with the ease and swiftness of practice. When he was done, he said, now pick one. Marnan sighed, but nonetheless pointed to the goblet on the right. Garrot smirked. Wrong. He lifted the goblet to reveal no marble. How could you have possibly known that? You weren't here when Emmett hid the marble. Because, Your Royal Highness. She winced, the marble ain't in any of them. That's the trick. He reached out and lifted the 2 remaining goblets. Sure enough, they were also empty. But, then where? In his palm the whole time. Emmett smiled wryly and held out his hand, revealing the marble. Marnan sat back in her chair, crossing her arms. I do not think much of this shell game. It seems a cruel one. The casteless threw his head back and laughed, and Marnan wished the brand did not make her feel so wrong-footed all the time. Did it matter if these games of cunning were not her forte? When it came to cutting down darkspawn, there was none better, and that was what mattered. So where'd you go, anyway? Ira asked the brand from the next table over. Garrot shrugged and dropped his pack down between the tables, a pack that Marnan realized was a great deal bulkier than it had been an hour ago, and it had a number of rather large weapons strapped to it. Marnan narrowed her eyes suspiciously. Where did you get those? To that, the brand grinned. Battlefield. Just outside and up the hill. You looted the dead? Hey, they weren't using M. I figured I might as well see they ended up in good hands. Namely, mine. You could not possibly have use for that sword. It's twice your height. Selling it for money is still a use, princess. Marnan couldn't take much more of this. She jumped to her feet. I've told you to stop calling me that. And what does it matter what you tell me to do? He sneered. You can order me to walk into a lost tag and die, princess, and I don't have to do shit but waggle my dangle at you and laugh. Because, like it or not, we're equals, princess. And there's not a damn thing you can do about it. Princess. That's it. She swept her werax off the table and launched herself at him, but didn't get within melee range before the door opened and Duncan came in. At it again, are you? He sounded tired, and Marnan aborted the attack, despite the way the brand was smirking at her, just daring her to strike. Ashamed at her loss of control, Marnan replaced her axe back on the table. I apologize, Duncan. I must learn some self-restraint. Tempers are frayed all around, it seems. Duncan came into the room, a robed young woman trailing in more slowly behind him. She was looking around curiously, seeming to study every detail of the room with both scrutiny and wonder. How was your trip to the tower? Marnan asked, watching the woman. Successful. Duncan smiled. Very. Felicity, would you like to meet your new companions? The girl named Felicity jumped, startled, then scurried over. I found 2 mages with a great deal of promise. I will be curious, Marnan, to know how you think it will be best to utilize their skills. Marnan nodded, curious herself. She had never had a mage before in battling the Darkspawn, simply because she'd never had a non-dwarf before. They sounded useful, to say the least. Felicity, this is Ira, Reg, Garrot, Emmett, and Marnan. Ira, Reg, and Emmett are Grey Wardens under my command, while Marnan and Garrot are recruits like yourself. Everyone, this is Felicity Amel. How do you do? Felicity said, smiling politely. I am so very excited to have a chance to fight against the Darkspawn. Granted, I don't expect to be in the thick of it, but I certainly have skills that will be crucial for seeing that there is as little loss on our side as possible. Felicity is a healer, Duncan supplied, mostly to Marnan. Well, I wouldn't say I'm a healer. The woman's dark skin flushed. I'm certainly nothing compared to the more experienced mages, but I've dabbled a bit in it. Also in herbalism, though Duncan would not allow me to bring my full recipe kit. She sighed sadly. The corner of Duncan's mouth lifted in half a smile. If I had allowed you to bring all the books and tools you wished to bring, we would have had to find a dragon to carry it all. Felicity's eyes widened in excitement. Oh, you don't suppose we'll see any dragons, do you? I've always been so curious about them, all that weight and yet still they can stay aloft indefinitely. All the wardens' faces darkened. Oh, Ira said, I can think of one dragon I'd rather not see any time soon. Felicity's face fell, and Marnan frowned, confused. Then, she remembered what the Shapers had taught her about the nature of blights, and what led them. Oh, right. She cried, causing everyone to look at her. She felt her face go hot. And then, you're dwarves, aren't you? Felicity said, and everyone was back to staring at the mage. She also flushed, but continued on. I haven't seen many dwarves. Only the traders who deliver lyrium to the tower, really, and they never stop to chat. But I've read so much about you, the history of the Tags is tragic, and all the knowledge that was lost. Like golems. Would that we could find a way to recover the golems. Emmett gave a low whistle and quietly said, lot of lung power in this one. Garrot chuckled. Felicity turned her attention to the male dwarf. That mark on your cheek, that's a face brand, right? I've seen diagrams in my readings on the Orzarmar caste system. Both dwarves stiffened. Is it true that each child born takes on the caste of the same-sex parent? Does that mean that one of your paternal grandfathers was a criminal, or does it work differently for the casteless? Garrot turned a sharp grin toward Marnan. Well, look at that, princess. Someone more insufferable than you. Enough, Duncan said with some exasperation. He turned a reproachful eye on Garrot, then Marnan. Now, I need you two to promise me that you will behave on the journey south. The dwarves exchanged a dark look. Very well, she said. As you say, boss, he said. Ira frowned. Duncan, you make it sound like you are not coming with us back to Ostagar. Duncan sighed. I'm not, at least not right away. The wardens started to protest, but Duncan waved them to silence. Shortly after I recruited him, Ser Jory mentioned a knight with some skill he'd met in Highever. As we are only a couple days southwest of there, I thought I might head over and scout him out. We can come with you, Marnan said. That will not be necessary. In fact, I suspect you will do far more good helping the king at Ostagar. No, tomorrow morning, you will all be headed south while I make my way north to Highever. Marnan seethed, disliking the prospect of allowing her commanding officer to head off alone. Still, she supposed traveling the surface world alone wasn't as dangerous as braving the deep roads. And Duncan could certainly handle himself, even if it was. So just how many new recruits are you planning to have? Emmett asked, taking a gulp from his mug. As many as it takes. I'm not complaining, Garrot rumbled. The more the merrier, though try not to pick any more women, boss. I think your taste in M is a little skewed. He smirked at Marnan. She fumed. Is this your definition of behaving? We ain't on the road yet, are we? Besides, I'm just calling it as I see it. Not my fault if it's truth when I say you're a stuck-up, hammer-brained bitch, now is it? Marnan had had quite enough of this whole exchange. Go walk into a lost tag and die, she snapped. Then, she stalked out the door to the sound of the brand's laughter. The sun was setting over Lake Callanhood. As Marnan stepped out into the evening, she had to blink so that her eyes adjusted. It still caught her by surprise, how the surface's only steady source of light moved. 2 weeks, she had been up here while the wardens worked their way down through the frost-back mountains, and still she could not shake just how much everything on the surface changed. The sun, the winds, the weather, life on the surface was just one change in situation after another, it seemed. It was unnerving at the same time that it was exciting. Who knew when water would next fall from the sky, after all? And there was one thing to be said about the sun, it was quite pretty. Marnan especially loved the colors the sky turned when it was first cresting the world in the morning, or when it was slipping away in the evening. There was simply no equivalent back home. And now, Marnan saw how the sunset sparkled off Lake Callanhood ahead of her, and she gasped at the sheer beauty before her. The circle tower was silhouetted against the oranges and pinks of the evening sky, surrounded by water that reflected the same. The sight was soothing, and wiped away all the frustration that had building up that day. As she strolled down to the lake shore and stood on the edge of the water, she completely forgot why she had stormed out here in the first place. The sound of carefree laughter pulled her away from her admiration of the sunset, and she noticed that she wasn't the only one outdoors. An elf was out on the water some distance to her left, dancing on top of the calm surface as if it were a solid floor. It took her a moment to realize that a shimmering sheen of ice coated the surface of the water where he frolicked, allowing him to stand atop the waves without fear of falling in. He waved his hands about, drawing graceful lines in the air. In the wake of his hands glittered more icy tendrils, creating frozen sculptures made of arches and curves around him that glittered in the sunset. He laughed again, tossing his head back and spreading his arms wide to the sky. Colorful sparks flickered around his hands, and he spun, showering them down upon his icy creations in a magnificent play of light on water. It was during this twirl that the elf noticed her watching. He lowered his arms and stopped spinning, but the carefree smile on his face remained. He, like Felicity, was dressed in robes, though he had faint, fiery tattoos across his face that the other mage had not. Marnan wondered at the meaning of such marks, then wondered whether they had any meaning at all. After a moment of the two just looking at one another, the elf said, "I've always wanted to do this." "Do what?" Marnan asked softly, not wanting to disrupt the moment. "Walk on the lake." He turned outward again to face the sun. It was always so close, just outside the doors. But we could never reach it. It was like a symbol, I guess. And now you're free of such restrictions, she hazarded, smiling. Yeah, free. He closed his eyes and raised his face up to the sky. You have no idea how free. Looking out at the sunset herself, she thought back to the world she had left behind. A world of intrigue and scheming. Where rank was everything, but cunning and manipulation were more than that. A world where Marnan had never been allowed to simply be what she was, free of the expectations of her birth and her caste. All caste aside, now. Actually, she said softly as she gazed out at the sunset, smiling for the first time in a long time. I think I do. 13 Betrayal. Bryce Cousland had been up late with Rendon when his old comrade had quite literally stabbed him in the back. To say it had been unexpected was an understatement. One moment, the two of them were discussing battles past and future over Amaranthin's finest vintage. The next moment, Bryce felt cold steel cut into his back, just above the waist. It was only Bryce's own battle instincts that saved him from instant death, as a turn of the hip sent the dagger plunging into his side rather than his kidney. It was a slightly less mortal wound, but barely. The next thing he knew, he was collapsed on the floor, watching Rendon's embroidered shoes walk away. Howe emitted a dark chuckle, and foreboding rippled through Bryce as Rendon bent out the door and said, "It's time." Rendon Howe had always been an ambitious man, and one particularly fond of the subtleties of politics, but Bryce would never have expected this from his old friend. Still, as he lay on the expensive carpet, feeling his lifeblood pour out of him, he knew that this would hardly be the end of it. Howe was, if anything, clever and thorough. If this was a coup, he would not stop killing at just the turn. Bryce pushed himself up, one hand clutching his side while the other supported his weight against the back of a stuffed chair. Rendon turned from the doorway in time to see Bryce straighten back to his full height. "Still alive, are we?" Howe chuckled, his voice curling around the words with disturbing pleasure. "You always were quite stolid, I suppose." "Easily remedied." "You won't get away with this, Rendon," Bryce hissed, feeling his head start swimming with blood loss. "Oh, yes, old friend. I think I will." Howe smiled the smile of a cat considering the canary. Too bad for him, the Cowsland family had always been far fonder of dogs. Bryce yanked an old sword off the mantel, bringing it to bear against the other noble. Howe skittered back. He'd never been much for straightforward dueling and slid out the door, calling for his men. Sure enough, 3 soldiers wearing Howe's crest stepped into the room, even as Rendon fled. Bryce cursed. Of course Rendon would have more of his men about. How many were here, waiting for Howe's signal to strike? By the Maker, Eleanor, and the children. The Terran of however had not earned his reputation for battle prowess lightly, and such did he prove to the 3 young men who sought to strike him down. Unarmored, wounded, and outnumbered, he still managed to overcome them. He was standing over the bodies, shaking off his lightheadedness and saying a quick prayer for the men's souls. They weren't to blame for the fact that their employer was a duplicitous snake, when Duncan of the Grey Wardens burst into the room. "You lordship, there's treachery." Duncan trailed off, taking in the scene. He stood in the doorway for a moment, holding a bloodied sword. "I see." Bryce took a step toward Duncan, then doubled over as pain shot up his injured side. Duncan was at his elbow immediately, steadying his swaying form. "Duncan, my family. We need to get you to safety, first." "No." Bryce tore out of Duncan's grip, and didn't so much walk out into the hall as stumble into it. "My wife and son, my grandson, the entire household is in danger." "More than you know, my lord." Bryce felt fear lance through him, and turned to Duncan. "How do you mean? What state are the castle defenses in?" Duncan shook his head sadly and started leading Bryce away from the sitting room where this treachery had begun. "There are no defenses, I'm afraid. They were waiting inside the castle for the signal. And now, they've cut off the exits. Sir Gilmore set up barricades to keep the main force out and is currently holding the main hall, but the outlook is grim. The estate is surrounded, and all exits are heavily guarded by Howe's men. Blast and damnation." Bryce cursed, then wobbled as a wave of coldness swept over him. "We have to get everyone out. I know many of these castles have hidden exits, in case of siege." Duncan prompted. Yes, that's right. We have a small exit through the kitchen larder. It's hidden and only used by the servants and rats. We need to secure it." He hissed and felt his knees buckle, but Duncan caught him and held him until the weakness passed. "Where is this exit, Tern?" This way." He pointed, and the 2 rushed off, Bryce stumbling in Duncan's wake. They met their share of invaders on the way, but Duncan was an efficient dual wielder and Bryce wasn't about to lay down and die yet, so it was nothing they couldn't handle. They reached the kitchens without too much ado. Bryce swallowed thickly as he stepped over the hacked-up body of the woman who had practically raised his sons. It was in the larder that Bryce's strength finally fled him entirely, and he fell to his knees on the stone. The sword clattered out of his limp grip. "You lordship." Duncan knelt down beside him, the grim look in his eyes confirming what Bryce already knew: he was dying. "Duncan, please. Go find my family. You must save them." I'll defend the exit." Bryce couldn't even stand, much less lift a sword, but the warden didn't say a word about it. Instead, he nodded grimly and rose back to his feet. I will return shortly, for better or for worse. As Duncan left through the larder door, Bryce couldn't help a small incredulous snort. The warden didn't mince words, a quality the Cowslands shared. Bryce tried to push himself upright again, leaning heavily on the larder shelves. Alas, his upper body had no more strength than his lower, and he ended up once again in a heap on the floor. Instead, he could only kneel there in the dark, listening to the distant sounds of his family's ancestral home being overrun. And then, after what seemed like a very long time, there was a new noise. A bark, and Bryce's heart lifted as a squashed snout nosed through the larder door. Hugo, his son's dog. But did that mean? Sure enough, the door swung wide, and Eleanor and Percival ran into the darkened room. Both were bearing armor and arms, and were splattered with blood. Very little of it seemed to be their own. There, you both are. Bryce managed to gasp out, then promptly collapsed to the stone. Eleanor spotted him first, throwing her bow to the ground to run over to him. She had dusted off her old leathers, it seemed. Covered in the blood of Howe's treachery as she was, Bryce thought she had never looked more beautiful. Father, they're dead, Percival's voice whispered emptily. Orin, and Oriana, and Malol, and Nan, and... His younger son knelt down beside him and helped Eleanor raise him into a sitting position. They slaughtered everyone. Looking into the boy's eyes was heartbreaking. Had this blood-splattered shadow been the same boy who, not 6 hours ago, had teasingly complained about the responsibility of running a keep? The one who had jested with his brother about his conquests? Now, Percival's blue eyes showed no laughter, only turmoil. This was the boy's first real battle as good with a blade as Percy was. All he'd known before this was sparring and tourneys, neither of which taught the lessons of death and pain that true combat did. Percy had always been a creature of passion, feeling things more strongly than his older brother. Bryce had always hoped to protect his younger son from this sort of pain. His laughing, bright-eyed, charming pup hadn't been cut out for the harsh truths of the battlefield. It seemed, however, that those truths had found his son all the same. Maker's breath, Bryce. Eleanor cried. You're bleeding. Why is Howe doing this, father? The plea in those words was a tired one, as if he'd been asking the same all night. Bryce had no hope of explaining the complex world of political intrigue to his younger boy. Instead, he met his son's eyes and opted for a firm, he can't get away this. Percival's hand went to the pommel of the long sword strapped to his back. His son was carrying the Cowsland family sword from the vault. Good, Howe wouldn't get it. Percival also had a shield with the high Evercrest strapped to his back. It was a sight that filled Bryce with a mixture of pride and pain. First, we have to get you out of here, Eleanor said, ever the practical one. Bryce shook his head sadly, feeling weakness pulling him down now more than ever. I won't survive the standing. Then we'll make our stand here, Percival said fiercely, some of his old spark returning to his eyes. No. Bryce cried, then hissed in pain. No, pup. Listen to me. You must take your mother to safety. Then, find Fergus and... He gasped as a stab of pain rocked him, tell him what's happened here. We won't leave you. The servant's exit is right here, Eleanor agreed. We'll find you healing magic. Again, Bryce shook his head. The Arl's men have the castle surrounded. I won't make it. I'm afraid the Terran is correct, Duncan said as he returned, wiping fresh blood off his sword. The castle is surrounded. Getting past will be difficult. Duncan knelt down as well. We can carry him out, Percy said sharply, his voice cracking like it hadn't in years. Then we can come back in and come after Howe. The rage and hatred the usually amiable young man put in that single name left Bryce little doubt that his death would be avenged. If Percival survived. We can't attack Howe here, Duncan said calmly. There are too many men, we'd never get to him. We have to try. Patience. For now, flight is the only option. I won't run away. It brought tears to the Terran's eyes, to see his son find his sense of duty at last. Duncan, Bryce said, you are under no obligation to me. But I beg you, take my wife and son to safety. I will, your lordship. Duncan nodded, despite Percy's shout of protest. But I fear I must ask for something in return. Anything. I came to Highever seeking a recruit. The Darkspawn threat demands that I leave with one. The request was respectful and reasonable, and promptly drowned out by one upset young pup. What? No. I won't agree to any such thing. You must, pup, Bryce whispered. Our family always does our duty first. My duty is to take vengeance on How. Again, Percival's voice seethed with rage at the name. But there were tears in his eyes. He was accepting that Bryce would not be coming with. Do so by living, pup. Take word of what has happened to your brother, and tell the king so that all of Ferelden will know what happened here. See that justice is done. Then, become a Grey Warden. I could never have asked for any more for you. Both mother and son were in tears now. Biting back sobs, Percy capitulated. Very well. I'll do it, father. For you. Hugo growled in the direction of the doorway. Duncan stood, glancing through the open entrance. We must leave quickly, then. Bryce, Eleanor pressed, laying a gentle hand on his side wound. Are you sure? Our son will not die of How's treachery, he said, mustering all the strength he had left to instill his faith and pride into his son's last moments with him. He will live, and make his mark on the world. Eleanor's grip on him tightened, then she turned to Percival. Darling, go with Duncan. Eleanor. Hush, Bryce. Her grip was strong and steady on his shoulders. I'll kill every bastard who comes through that door to buy them time. Percival sobbed in earnest now. I love you both, so much. He let Duncan pull him to his feet. A great crash sounded throughout the castle. Hugo started barking. They've broken through the gates, Duncan said. We must go now. Goodbye, darling, Eleanor said. You do us proud, Bryce gasped. Percival opened his mouth as if to say something, but Duncan pulled him away and the two men disappeared through the servants' exit. The last view Bryce had of his younger son was of Percival bearing the Cow's landsword and the Highever shield, tears in his eyes and hound at his heels as he disappeared into the night to face his destiny. Then, black closed in one his vision, and Bryce gripped Eleanor's arm. He would die in the care of his wife. His beautiful, fierce, proud wife. I'm sorry it's come to this, my love. We did the best we could. It's in the hands of our children now. She hugged him one last time and set him down on the stones. Then she picked up her bow and aimed it at the doorway as the sounds of armored footsteps drew closer. Goodbye, my love. I will join you soon, darling. And then his world faded to black. 14 An army of new recruits. Alistair wound his way through the king's camp, his splint mail boots kicking up dust and other things, as he hurried past kennels and practice ranges. He'd been in the mess tent when he'd heard, which was why he still carried a half-eaten loaf of tack bread, forgotten in his right hand. Word had rippled through camp, the scouts had seen the Grey Wardens approaching on the road, and they had several others with them. Finally, it sounded like Duncan had returned. Whoa! Alistair nearly tripped over a mulberry in his hurry, but managed to dance into a turn that kept him on his feet. Watch it! The mulberry's handler snapped. Sorry. Alistair called, but he was already moving toward the front gates again. Duncan was back, so Alistair had no time for lectures on camp propriety and long-winded apologies. He rounded the corner into view of the huge bridge that connected the camp to the Tower of Ishal. There, he skidded to a stop as he saw the group halfway down it, crossing toward him. Alistair frowned, spotting Reg's bow first, and then Ira and Emmett, but no Duncan. It looked like they'd picked up some recruits in Orzammar, though. And, judging by the two figures in robes walking behind the wardens, they'd made a stop at the circle tower as well. Oh joy! Mages! Alistair! Emmett laughed, waving as they came into speaking range. By the Maker, is it good to see another familiar face? Alistair smirked, leaning against the ruin's stone facade as the group stepped up to meet him. Did you lose something? Or should I say someone? Duncan ran off to Highever, Ira said, looking tired and annoyed, looking for more recruits. Apparently, He wants to build an army just out of new Grey Warden recruits. Alistair raised his half-eaten loaf and toast. The more the merrier. The dwarf man let out a low rumbling chuckle. That's what I said. Alistair blinked, recalling the new recruit's presence. He slapped his head. Oh, where are my manners? He stood up straight and spread out his arms. Welcome, everyone, to Ostagar. Sight of glory, and dark spawn slaying, and a fair bit of dog leavings, so watch your step. I am Alistair, one of your soon-to-be comrades, if all goes well. Well met, Alistair, the dwarf woman said, stepping forward with a bow of her head. I am Marnan. The other dwarf cast an arched eyebrow at the woman, as if puzzled by something in that rather straightforward introduction. Garrot Broska, he grunted. No bow from him, then. My name is Felicity, said the female mage with a distracted air. She seemed to find something utterly fascinating about the ruin around them, judging by the way her head kept turning about. When Alistair turned to the other mage, all he got from the elf was a narrow-eyed glare. The kind of glare that said, I'm going to turn you into a frog just so I can have frog's legs for dinner. Ouch. You're a Templar, the elf snapped. Ex-Templar, thank you very much. Now I'm just Ferelden's most junior Grey Warden. A position I much prefer, I might add. The elf mage didn't stop glaring. And then Marnan asked, what's a Templar? A Chantry mage hunter, Felicity said, now fully attending to the conversation. She gave Alistair a considering look. How did you get untangled from that? Even if your recruiter invoked the right of conscription, certainly the lyrium withdrawal should have been most painful. Or are you still being supplied with lyrium? Does it help against darkspawn mages as well? Whoa, okay, Alistair laughed uncomfortably. Very much not a discussion I want to have right now. But no, I'm not addicted to lyrium. Duncan pulled me out before I had to take my vows. Now can we talk about something else? I think the elf is trying to fry me with his brain. The elf's eyes only narrowed further. Rest assured, if I wanted to fry you, you'd be a charred husk by now. Okay. Right then. Mess tents this way. Garrot snorted. Best thing I've heard all day. He started in the direction Alistair indicated, and the rest of the group followed behind. Alistair fell into step next to the other wardens. Did Duncan say how long he'd be? Emmett shrugged. Who knows, with Duncan. He could be a couple days behind us, or it could be another 2 weeks. Alistair sighed and, recalling the loaf of bread in his hand, took a bite. And so in the meantime, we'll be stuck here, just twiddling our thumbs I suppose. Emmett laughed. Well, from what I've seen of the new recruits, just twiddling our thumbs would be a good thing. 15 A desperate rescue. If we run into trouble, Soreyes had warned him, we won't be able to talk our way out of it. Finian had just smiled tightly and said something about how he could talk his way out of anything. Soreyes would say, I told you so, if his stomach would stop heaving. The plan had started out well enough. They snuck past the kitchens without incident by keeping their heads down, pretending to just be common servants. Soreyes did see a couple of the estate's nicer trinkets disappear into Finian's pocket, but his cousin was careful enough not to get caught at it. But then they opened a door and stumbled onto a trio of guards standing over Nola's body, the humans making disgusting comments about how she was still warm enough if they're not too picky, and something in his cousin snapped. The next thing Soreyes knew, daggers popped out of Finian's sleeves and cut twin trails across the first guard's throat. Things had spiraled down from there. Now, they were cutting their way through the Arl of Denerim's palace, leaving a trail of human bodies behind them. Soreyes had a guard's stolen longsword clutched tight in one hand, though it was slippery with blood by now. This is bad, this is bad, this is bad, Soreyes couldn't stop muttering as they ran through the palace corridors. They were going to be in so much trouble for this, if they even made it out alive. Finian didn't say anything, and that scared the crap out of Soreyes. They rounded a corner and came face to face with one of the bodyguards that had accompanied Ban Vaughn to the alienage. The man was leaning outside a closed door, looking bored. 2 armed, blood-covered elves caught his interest, though. The guard didn't ask any questions, just attacked. Sarais brought his sword up once again when the guard swung his mace in, and the elf managed to messily parry the swing. He wasn't particularly strong or skilled, and he would have given his life's savings for some armor right now, but he didn't really need to be all that good. He was just the distraction. Sarais didn't know where Finian had learned how to fight, though he suspected his Aunt Finian's mother had something to do with it. Aunt Adea had reputedly been something of a wanderer before meeting Uncle Syrian and settling down. It seemed she hadn't settled down too much, if she'd taught her son to fight like this even under the watchful eyes of the alienage guards. Finian flitted behind the guard, his daggers simultaneously going into the human's sides, then pulling back out. When the guard stumbled, Finian kicked him in the back, and Sarais stabbed his own sword in while the man was distracted by the pain. Sarais's sword was still stuck in the shem when he fell, so Sarais toppled to the ground after him with a squeak. Finian laughed. Once. It was wheezy and tight, but Sarais was glad to see his cousin's grim expression crack, despite the oh-so-very grim circumstances. To think, the day had started out so promising. A double wedding, it should have been exciting, despite Finian's twitchiness over the prospect. Then the humans had arrived, and everything since then, the arguments, the abductions, the infiltration, had been one long nightmare. His cousin helped Sarais extract his sword, then held out a hand to pull him to his feet. When Finn was trying to pull him up, their blood-slicked grips slipped loose, and both went tumbling down onto the expensive rugs. Finian, lying flat on the floor, threw back his head and laughed, maybe just a little hysterically. Ha ha ha. By the Maker, ha ha, we are in so far over our heads, aren't we? Sarais sighed in relief and sat up. We must be crazy to try this. Are we crazy, cousin? Probably. Finian sighed and turned his head toward Sarais, all mirth leaving his eyes. But someone has to be. We can't just let him, that he would. Finn closed his eyes and turned away, apparently overcome. We'll save them, cousin, Sarais assured him, his voice holding a great deal more confidence than he felt. We have to. Finian's eyes opened again, this time sparkling with tears. It's my fault, Sarais. If I hadn't tried to talk to the bastard twice, he wouldn't have been able to take the women. If we'd just fought him when we had the chance, we'd all be dead. You know the guards would never have let us get away with that, they'd have seen it as some sort of riot. Sarais sighed, tossing the borrowed sword between his hands. Though they probably won't be very happy about this, either. No, I don't think they will. Finian looked at him then, his eyes surprisingly clear and considering. Sarais wondered what was going through Finn's head, to make his cousin look at him like that. Finally, after being stared at for almost a minute, Sarais cleared his throat and stood up. He dusted himself off by force of habit, and only managed to smear more blood onto his borrowed servant's linens. Well, we should get moving. Finn nodded and climbed to his feet, not even bothering to sheath his daggers. They pushed through the door into an empty antechamber. That was when they heard the sound of someone crying. Both elves ran to the other door, bursting through it together. Inside the bedroom beyond was what or who they had come for. Two men in rich clothing. Sarais recognized them as the men who had come with Vaughn to the alienage. Knelt on a plush carpet in the middle of the room, holding down an elven woman. That woman, Sarais realized, was Shiani, and the tear-streaked face she raised to them when they entered made Sarais want to rip out the throats of all humans present. Vaughn, standing over the others, turned at the sound of the door opening. He'd been smirking, but that expression died as he took in the sight of them. Well, look at that, one of the nobles sneered. Some more elves want to join the party. Quiet, you idiot, Vaughn snapped. They're covered with enough blood to fill a tub. What do you think that means? Finian stepped forward, wearing one of his patented cheeky smirks, though this one was quite a bit darker than it was when he was just riling guards. We heard there was a party. We wanted to dress for the occasion, but we didn't have enough dead babies to suit your tastes, so we went with the blood of your guards instead. So I see. The nobleman's eyes flickered toward the blades both elves held bared, and Sarais was surprised to see fear flash through the man's eyes. He was a sick bastard, but he wasn't stupid. All right. Let's not be too hasty here. Surely, we can talk this over. Finn's grin turned into a rictus. But we already did, at the alienage. I seem to remember us having a rousing conversation. You made an excellent point with that backhand of yours. I thought I might offer my counter-argument. He pointedly flicked his daggers, splattering blood all over the bedroom carpets. Vaughn stared at the daggers, and there was a moment of silence where the only sound in the room was Shiani's sniffles. Then, Vaughn raised his eyes again, a sly smile stealing across his face. Sarais knew that look. It was the same look Finian wore when his tongue was about to get its most silver. Think for a minute, Vaughn said silkily. Kill me, and you ruin more lives than just your own. By dawn, the city will run red with elven blood. Sarais felt his own sword lowering. The Shem was right, this was a bad idea. Vaughn dared to take a step toward them, his voice gaining confidence. Think about it. Or we could talk this through. Now that you have my undivided attention. Finian did something unexpected, then. He threw back his head and laughed. Everyone stood, frozen in a stalemate, while the elf's laughter bounced off the walls. Oh, you're good. Finian crowed. The calming tone, the confident stance. The way you figured out what was most important to us and used it against us. If I didn't know better, I'd never guess you were terrified for your own life. His laughter abruptly stopped, and his face darkened. But see, I do the same dance, so I know all the steps. You know we can kill you. He twirled his daggers deftly around his hands. You want to talk, Ban? Then let's talk about how you're going to let the women go before I get a little stab happy. Please, Shiani's voice pled. Please, I want to go home. I always had every intention of returning your women, Vaughn said smoothly. A little worse for wear, perhaps, but all alive, I assure you. Sarais felt himself pale, looking down again at Shiani. His female cousin was staring down at the carpet, suppressing sobs. If you... Finian took a harsh breath. You've got a lot of nerve, treating other people like that. Oh, that is cute. You think you're people. People enough to kill you. Finian's voice went low. You know what? I'm done talking. One of his hands flicked up and back, and one of his daggers soared across the room, lodging itself in Vaughn's chest. The band stumbled back, but his two friends leapt forward in his defense. As all three nobles drew the swords at their hips, Sarais gulped and brought his own sword to bear. What happened next was a frenzy of whirling blades and pain. It was all Sarais could do to dodge most of the swords swinging at him. The band's two friends were both going after him. For some reason, they probably figured he was the easier target, which he wouldn't deny, which meant he was ducking under and parrying blades from both sides. It didn't surprise him when he felt one of the blades graze his hip, and then another swipe through his shoulder. But he got a couple lucky shots in himself, and one of the nobles went down after Sarais' sword found his throat. Sarais barely ducked in time to avoid getting his head chopped off by the other guy. You know what my favorite thing about you knife ears is? Sarais could hear Vaughn say tauntingly. You're women. So lithe and supple, and unable to do a damn thing about me claiming what's rightfully mine. Shut up. Finian could be heard shouting, but Sarais didn't have time to look over and see how that duel was faring. He stumbled back as his opponent's sword swept his aside, then twisted. Pain lanced up the elf's arm at the maneuver, and his sword slipped from his grip. Unarmed, Sarais could only back away from the noble advancing on him. The Shem smirked, sensing victory. Clonk. The man fell, and Sarais saw Shiani standing behind the human, a heavy book in her hands. She looked up at Sarais with wide, pained eyes, then collapsed. Sarais leapt forward to catch her, easing his cousin to lie back on the floor. Her face was tight with pain, and her hands were fisted over her stomach. Sarais swallowed nausea at what this implied. She needed healing, and him throwing up wouldn't help matters. Finn. Shiani whispered, looking over Sarais' shoulder. He turned and saw that the rest of the battle had resolved itself in Finian's favor, though the sight made Sarais' gorge rise once again. His cousin was straddling Vaughn's defeated form, shaking and stabbing into the corpse again and again. The young man's usually expressive eyes were wide and scarily blank. Again, the dagger stabbed in. And again. The body's chest cavity was a mess of gore. Finian, Sore Eyes managed. Fin, he's dead. The dagger stabbed in one last time. Then, Finian sagged, a ragged, Maker. Passing through his lips. Maker. Sore Eyes, what have we done? Oh Maker, we killed them all. Sore Eyes forced out a laugh. Don't fall apart on me now, cousin. If you go crazy, there's no hope for me. Finian blinked up at him, then seemed to recall himself. Shiani. Shiani, are you all right? Shiani didn't answer at first. She looked between them. Take me home. Please. Yes, of course, Sore Eyes assured her, then stood up. I'm going to go look for the other women. Fin nodded and stood up himself. As Sore Eyes left the room, he saw Finian head over to check on Shiani himself. As soon as he was out of their sight, Sore Eyes sighed in relief, then promptly got sick in a flower pot. They collected the other women who were in a better state than Shiani, thanked the Maker and headed out of the palace by the same bloody path they'd come. Sore Eyes took the rear guard, and it was saddening to see the way they huddled together. Poor Valora, if what had happened to Shiani had happened to her. No wait. That was an awful thought. It shouldn't have happened at all. Finian procured a pair of cloaks from among the launderer's things, so that the men wouldn't attract too much unwanted attention with their blood-stained garb. Sore Eyes had to leave the sword behind, though he felt vulnerable without it. After this ordeal, he doubted he'd ever feel perfectly safe ever again. When they returned to the alienage, they found a small crowd waiting for them. Valandrian was at the head of it, with a good amount of worried elven faces behind him. As soon as the rescued women came through the door, their families and friends rushed forward to greet them. Sore Eyes looked away from the sight of Nora's father searching in vain for his daughter. Sore Eyes' eyes turned to the side, to a sight that made him tense up and miss the weight of that sword. There were humans in the alienage again that had worked out so terribly for all involved last time that Sore Eyes wondered why Valandrian allowed their presence so soon afterwards. They stood back from the crowd, respectful of the community's private matters. The closest one was tall, bearded, and armed. His face watched the proceedings with a compassionate, yet shrewd, eye. His contemplative gaze briefly met Sore Eyes', and the elf looked away. The other two watched from behind the bearded human, both leaning against the wall of one of the houses. One was a scruffy, dark-haired man with keen eyes and a bow on his back. He watched the elves avidly, one brow arched as his gaze followed Finian. The other man was blond, and would have been handsome if his eyes weren't so icily cold. He leaned against the wooden wall with his arms crossed, his gaze absent as he scanned the crowd, as if he wasn't even aware of what was going on. There was a gigantic dog at his knee, and Sore Eyes shivered. There had been such dogs guarding the Urian estate. Tell me, Elder Valandrian said as the two men stopped in front of him. What happened? Sore Eyes exchanged a look with Finian. The latter sighed and tried to dredge up a small, wry smile. We asked nicely. The elder eyed the bloodstains that covered them both. I see. We won't have much time, then. He glanced over at the bearded man. Duncan, I think now is a good time to finish our discussion. The bearded human stepped forward, and Sore Eyes noticed Finian tensing. It seemed Sore Eyes wasn't the only one shaking off the sense of fight or flight. This is Duncan, the alienage elder explained. He's a Grey Warden, and an old friend of mine. Valandrian speaks highly of you, Finian Tabri, the human said, quite respectfully. Finian blinked, obviously taken aback. Then, he threw on an abashed smile. You obviously have me mistaken for some other Finian Tabri. I'm just the local lovable rogue. Somehow, I suspect you are quite a bit more than that. Duncan eyed the bloodstains pointedly. I came here to ask Valandrian about possible recruits, but found the entire place in quite an uproar when I arrived. Not many mere pickpockets would risk themselves to rescue others. Finian shrugged. They'd taken my family and friends. I just retrieved them. And it is that attitude that does you so much credit. It takes more than fighting skill to be a Grey Warden. He nodded behind him, to the other humans. Finian's eyes landed on the brunette man and widened. Wah, you. The scruffy human smirked. Said I'd be seeing you around, didn't I? He made a motion toward his cheek. You've a bit of blood, right there. Finian absently rubbed his cheek, where a splatter of blood had, indeed, dried. It did not come off. Heavy footsteps heralded the arrival of the town guard, and most of the elves in the square scattered. Sarais made to go with them, but Valandrian laid a hand on his arm. "Don't panic," he said firmly. "Let's see what comes of this." Sarais swallowed thickly, but nodded. That didn't stop him from hiding behind Finian, though, as a small contingent of guards rounded the corner into the square. "I seek the elder of the alienage," the leader called. "Is he here?" Said elder stepped forward. "I am Valandrian, Captain," he said calmly. "I take it you're here about today's disruption." "Disruption?" the captain said sternly. "Either you are playing dumb, or you have no idea what was perpetrated just now." The captain raised his voice so that any elves brave, and stupid, enough to remain nearby could hear. "The Arl's son lies dead in a river of blood that runs through the entire palace. I need names, and I need them now." Sarais felt himself go cold, and he drew the concealing cloak tighter around himself. This was it, he was sure of it. He was never going to see the light of day again, never going to see Valora again, to know what sort of life he might have had with her. A hand on his arm startled him out of his panic spiral, and he looked up to see Finian flash him a wry smile. Then, the hand left as his cousin stepped forward. "It was my doing," Finian said. What? What was his crazy cousin doing?" The captain scoffed. "You expect me to believe one man did all that?" Sarais started to step forward himself, but Valandrian stopped him with a hand. "We are not all helpless," the elder said firmly, and Sarais wondered whether Valandrian was speaking to the captain or to him. What did the elder know? What was going on? The captain considered his cousin with honest respect, so very rare from a human to an elf. "You've saved lives by coming forward. I don't envy your fate, but I applaud your courage." Again, he raised his voice. "This elf will wait in the dungeons until the Arl returns. The rest of you, back to your houses." Many elves disappeared through doors and around corners, but just as many stayed to watch this until the bitter end. Sarais was one of those who stayed, though he had to fight back tears over what his cousin was doing for him. Prison was one of Finn's biggest fears, and yet he was willing to. He owed it to Finian to stay. His cousin was white as a ghost, but he made no attempt to go back on his words. Then, Duncan stepped forward. "Captain. A word, if you please." "What is it, Grey Warden?" "I'm afraid I must intervene on behalf of this man. I hereby invoke the right of conscription. I remove this prisoner into my custody." Sarais wasn't the only one who stared, he saw Finian jerk around to gape at the warden as well. Valandrian, however, watched the exchange with a soft, knowing smile. You can do that." Finian sputtered. Sarais almost laughed at seeing his silver-tongued cousin so tongue-tied. "Son of a tied down." The captain groaned. Again. He cast a glance back at the scruffier of Duncan's human companions. The brunette grinned and waved. The captain scowled and turned back to Duncan. "Very well. I cannot challenge you. But for the love of the Maker, get this elf out of the city. Today. He must not be around when the news hits." Duncan bowed his head. "Agreed." With that, the captain brusquely excused himself and motioned for his men to move out. Finian looked dumbstruck, watching the guards who might have arrested him calmly walk away, and Sarais couldn't say he blamed his cousin. He was a little dumbstruck himself. I can't believe you did that." Finn turned at the sound of Sorais's voice. Then, he smiled with such relief that Sorais couldn't help but mirror it. "Honestly," Finian laughed, "I can't either." He shook his head. "Wow. Me, a Grey Warden, it feels amazing." Sarais ventured. "Weird," Finn laughed. "So, you're leaving then?" Sarais felt his smile fade. "I mean, of course you're leaving." "Heh, dumb question." "Yeah." Finian blinked, and started looking around the alienage as if seeing it for the first time. "Yeah, I have to leave." A slow smile stole onto his lips. "By the Maker." I'm actually getting out of here. He grinned at Sore Eyes. I told you so, didn't I? I told you I'd find a way to get out and... His face fell again. And leave you all behind. Sore Eyes could tell his cousin was struggling with how to feel about all of this, so he just put a hand on Finn's shoulder. It's not like you won't be able to visit. Shiani and me will be expecting handouts, after all. Being the family of a Grey Warden has got to have its perks, right? That seemed to settle Finian's anxiety, because his grin turned bright again. Damn straight it will, and I entirely intend to play favorites. You'll keep my father and Shiani safe while I'm gone, right? Of course. And you'll keep Ferelden safe in return. By the Maker, Sore Eyes, Finian laughed. You make me sound like an actual hero, or something. Sore Eyes, however, wasn't laughing. Well, you have been my hero since we were kids. It's just official now. Finian again looked a little dumbstruck, so Sore Eyes just squeezed his shoulder and left. When he glanced back at his cousin one last time, Duncan had started talking to him, Finian smiling that sly way he had when he was looking for openings for his word games. The Grey Wardens had no idea what they were in for. Sore Eyes smiled and turned back around, heading back home. He had business with Valora to attend to, after all. 16 Virtanadal. The boar rushed at her, but Mila kept her bow level. It already had 2 shafts in its flank, causing it to skid slightly in the swamp mud. She loosed the next arrow, which landed in the animal's shoulder. The boar tossed its head, changing its course to go wide around her. She pulled another arrow from her quiver as it tore through the foliage to her right, grunting and squealing. She knocked the arrow and was about to draw the bowstring when it happened again. Burning, tight and hot, tore through her. It always started in the vicinity of her stomach, but then rushed through her with the swiftness and relentlessness of a mighty river, sweeping away her consciousness for the brief moment when she knew nothing but tearing pain. She clenched her teeth so as not to cry out, her eyes shutting without her consent and her arrow dropping from her fingers, even while her left hand clenched on her bow. Slowly, oh so very slowly, the pain receded. While she was recovering, the boar tore out of the foliage, slamming its tusk into her leg, tearing a gash in it. She dodged back before it could do any more damage, then deftly pulled out another arrow and released it at point-blank range into its eye. The boar finally collapsed, skidding heavily through the mud. Limping slightly, Mila stowed her bow and knelt down beside it, careful to keep her injured leg out of the swamp water. She retrieved the arrows and inspected each one for cracks or bends. Any arrows deemed worthy were returned to her quiver, while the rest were stowed in her bag to be disposed of later. A Dalish did not leave a trail, after all, and Dalish arrows did tend to stand out in the wilderness if left just lying about. Only then did she allow herself to take out her hunting knife and cut off part of its tusk. This, she stowed in a special pouch at her belt, to be later carved into a bead. Then, she heft the boar onto her shoulders, doing her best not to think about how her body quivered under the weight, as it very well should not have, and turned to start back to camp. It had been a couple days since she'd visited, and the Shemlin tended to get uppity if she didn't check in every now and then. When she had first arrived at Ostagar, she had roamed the wilds for the better part of a week. When she'd returned to the human camp to check whether Duncan had returned, everyone had been shocked to see her alive. They had assumed she'd wandered off and died, and several wardens had attempted to impress upon her the danger of wandering the wilds alone. She had ignored them, but had nonetheless agreed to return every couple days. She didn't really care much what the Shemlin thought of her roaming the Korkari wilds, but she had made a promise to keep her Maradhari that she would live and fight the Darkspawn in Tamlin's memory. And as that required that she become a Grey Warden, she had to play by their rules. Occasionally. It had been a month, now, and she did not honestly see why the Shemlin feared the forest so much. Certainly, it was a bit swampier than Mila was used to, and she did occasionally run into roving bands of wild folk, but any obstacles were easily avoided or overcome by one as at home in the wilderness as she was. There were the occasional Darkspawn, of course, but after what they'd done to herself and Tamlin, she was all too eager to strike against them. When she found a band, she would follow it, picking off the individuals one by one from a safe distance. Then, when the band noticed her, she simply retreated into hiding until they had given up the chase. It was then only a matter of tracking them and once again picking off the members from a distance. After a month of doing so, she liked to think she was making some mark upon the beasts. Tracking her way back to camp wasn't particularly difficult. One simply had to find the streams of Shemlin, scouting parties, and soon Ostagar's gate into the wilds appeared from among the foliage. The gate was closed this time, as it was every other time. Rather than ask the human guards on the other side to open it, a truly embarrassing prospect, she instead walked to the familiar crooked tree that grew right beside the gate. Its branches reached up over the 20-foot wall that separated the camp from the wilds, tall enough for her purposes. All it took was a bit of rope to pulley the boar carcass up into the tree. Then, she tied off the rope and followed it up, climbing deftly from branch to branch. The injury in her leg pulled uncomfortably as she climbed, but she merely ignored the pain, as she did the swirling dizziness that was a near constant companion these days. Then, she was looking over the top of the wall, perched in the tree while she gazed over the Ostagar camp. Tents littered the grounds, of course, many flying flags with symbols or pictures on them. Humans swarmed among the tents, talking, eating, training. None of them doing anything particularly productive. There had been a couple small battles against the Darkspawn since Mila had arrived, but the humans really seemed to spend most of their time sitting around, wasting resources. Worse than that, however, were the Flat Ears. They were servants and messengers nearly to a man, and that thought twisted Mila's gut. How did none of them see that they were still slaves, merely with a nicer cage? They spoke like Shemlin, walked like Shemlin, even cursed by the Shemlin maker. They had no concept of self outside what the Shemlin had made them into, no sense of history or culture. She ached for them. She pitied them. She hated them. She wanted to see them all freed. At the same time she wanted to destroy such echoes of past entrapment. It was a jarring contradiction, and she was beginning to understand why Pavel had always said that their duty was to educate the Flat Ears. They didn't realize all that they had given up, all that they could be again. But changing them was a task no elf could do alone. Mila levered the boar up and over the wall and untied its rope, and it fell on the other side with a heavy, wet plop. The guards near the gate startled and spun, even as Mila swung over the wall herself and landed on the ground beside the boar. Maker's breath, stop doing that. Mila did not acknowledge the humans, merely picked up her boar and made her way to the Grey Warden camp. It was nestled amongst the other pavilions, a relatively small collection of cook fires and tents, at least compared to the many other armies present. There was a mess tent near the Warden camp, which serviced it and the nearby forces with hardtack and gruel. That was where she took her catch, raising her chin against the stares that the Shemlin always gave her when she was in camp. Then, when she was within sight of the tent, a particularly vicious wave of dizziness overtook her, and she stumbled a step before she managed to get her knees locked. She couldn't show signs of weakness, not here. What the? Andrastes knickers, Mila. Of all the times for her self-appointed minder to appear. Fenharil must have been laughing at her. And there he was, the obnoxious blonde human who kept claiming to be responsible for the new recruits. He was in front of her then, helping keep the boar from slipping off her shoulders. Still fighting off the increased dizziness, she could only glare at him stonily. What? Oh, were you carrying this? He said. And why not, since it's only the same weight you are? I am hardly delicate, she said shortly. No, but you are sick. And, for the love of, is that a leg wound? I don't need your help, she said, and pulled away from him, dizziness be damned. She masked another stumble as best she could and continued onto the tent. There was another human with the blonde Shemlin this time, one Mila recognized as one of the wardens who had left with Duncan. Good, perhaps Duncan was back, and she could get this whole ordeal over with. Alistair, is this typical? The other asked. Oh, yes, Reg, it is. This is what she does. She disappears for days at a time, and returns with something twice her size slung across her back. I think she thinks we're incapable of feeding ourselves. She dropped the boar off with the cooks. They were always startled by her arrival, but then they took pains to thank her profusely for whatever she brought for the table. While she appreciated the sentiment, it nonetheless rankled to be so lauded for something she was supposed to be doing anyway. She was a hunter. It was her duty to supply the clan, or camp, she supposed, so why did they always seem so shocked when she did so? She stepped back out of the tent, and noticed with some annoyance that the two wardens were still there, waiting for her. "One of the recruits is a healer," said the stranger. "We should really take you back to camp to get that leg looked at." She stiffened at the tone of his voice, like he was speaking of a pet that had gotten its muzzle scratched. The blonde snorted a laugh. "No, no. That's not how you talk to her." He stepped forward, sweeping a bow. "Mila, might we perhaps suggest, as respectful equals, that you maybe could consider accompanying us back to camp, if you're not too busy, of course. Don't patronize me, Shemlin." Alistair straightened and let out an exaggerated sigh. There's just no winning, with her. Even so, she followed them as the pair started back toward their camp. Walking around the swamp with an open wound was ill-advised, after all. She couldn't bear to have it get infected, and then be forced to rely on the Shemlin for succor. No, better to head it off now. They weaved their way through the warden camp, finally coming to stop at a small pitch next to a cluster of tents. On the pitch, a Durgenlen woman was leading a group of the camp's grey wardens, as well as the human named Serjori, through some sort of training exercise. It involved them pushing at one another while holding onto long poles, and that was all Mila really cared to understand about it. Next to the pitch were 5 people. 2 were the other wardens that had left with Duncan, though not Duncan himself, she noted. They were speaking with another Durgenlen, who held some sort of metal device between them and motioned to one rather sharp-looking edge as she watched. This one had a curving tattoo on one cheek. She wondered if it carried as much meaning as her own did. Beside them sat a dark-skinned Shemlin woman in robes. She worked at a mortar and pestle amidst several stacks of pressed leaves and dried roots. Mila had seen the keeper at work often enough to know an herbalist when she saw one. Some distance away from the rest of the group stood a robed elf. Mila knew he was a flat ear just by the clothes he wore and the way he watched the humans without showing any apparent awareness of their crimes. However, he stood with a particular defiance that had been lacking in the other flat ears she'd seen in camp, as if he had never, and would never, bow and scrape as other flat ears did. That, Mila could respect. What she could not respect, however, were the faint tattoos that were scrawled across the flat ear's face. Were those supposed to be Valislin? If so, they certainly weren't in any of the traditional designs, and this flat ear looked to be too young to have earned the blood writing the proper way. It made a mockery of the culture of the Elvaean, and only her own silent repetition of Pavel's lessons about tolerating the flat ear's ignorance, so it might one day be rectified, stopped her from gutting him for insolence right there. The flat ear stood separate from the group, watching the combat practice with a bored air. Thus, he was the first to notice the trio's approach. When he spotted Mila, he stared openly. Like a child confronted with his first Sylvan. When she shot him a cold look that communicated her displeasure with him, his eyes narrowed in return. Mila ignored the challenge in them and turned to the blonde human, Alistair. "Has Duncan returned?" "What?" "Oh, no. Not as such." He made a face. "I'm starting to think he just doesn't want to be here, to be honest. Can't say I blame him, getting stuck between the king and Loghain as he is. Must be a lot like getting stuck between a wet cat and a hungry dog." He glanced back at her with a smirk. "Or between you and any human, actually." She stared flatly at him, wondering if it would be a betrayal of her promise to scalp one of the Grey Wardens who was supposed to train her. "And now you're scary again. Seems to be a pattern." Alistar turned to the group ahead of them, and Mila noticed that the wardens on the pitch had stopped their practice to watch their approach. "All right, everyone. Allow me to introduce Mila." He trailed off, then turned to her with brows furrowed. "Actually, I don't know your last name." She didn't deign to respond, just waited for him to get on with it. "Right. Anyway, she's another of Duncan's recruits, though you wouldn't know it with how little time she actually spends in camp." "Well met, Mila," the female dwarf stepped forward with a bow of her head. "I am Marnan." "Oh my. Your leg. That was from the herbalist." The woman picked herself up and hurried forward, reaching out a hand and invading Mila's personal space without so much as a "how do you do." Mila skittered back a bit too quickly from the human's upraised hand. "Do not touch me, Shemlin," she snapped. Everyone stared, including the herbalist. Then, the male Durgenlen snorted. I don't know what that word means, but I'm pretty sure it was an insult. What's a Shemlin? The one named Marnan asked the general group. As if they would know. Then, to Mila's surprise, one of them said, it means quick cling. Mila stared at the herbalist, who still stood only a few paces in front of her. Now, the human was studying her avidly. It's a very old elven word, referencing humans' shorter lifespans. Or at least, they were shorter at the time. It's said that elves lost their immortality because of proximity to us. She paused and glanced back at the male dwarf. So I suppose, depending on context, it could certainly be an insult. Mila was absolutely astounded. This human? You know my people's history. The human shrugged and smiled wryly. Well, some. Only what Brother Genitivi detailed in the Travels of a Chantry Scholar. But he wrote as an outsider, so I imagine there must have been much he missed. The woman brightened, her voice picking up speed as she spoke. You're Dalish, right? I can tell by your Valislin. Am I saying that right? Valislin. Yes. I've never seen one before, though I've seen them illustrated. Which creator does yours represent? Mila took a moment of the ensuing silence to recover from that onslaught. She could feel the gazes of the others on her, and got the distinct impression that several of them found something humorous in this situation. Still, Mila found it hard not to stare back at the human who was asking such informed questions about her culture. Finally, with not a little wonder, she said, You really want to know, don't you? The human nodded enthusiastically. Elven perspectives are so rare among Ferelden scholarship, since the Imperium took such great pains to wipe it out. She paused, her eyes widening. Oh no. I probably shouldn't have mentioned that to a Dalish. I'm sorry. No, Mila said, still somewhat in awe of this human. It is good to hear a Shemlin acknowledge it. The human relaxed, and Mila found herself doing so as well, just a bit. As to your question, my Valislin is a dedication to Andruil, Lady of the Hunt. The woman stayed silent, as if waiting to hear more. Mila could not do anything but continue. She felt a small smile creep onto her face as she spoke of familiar matters. Through my Valislin, Andruil guides my bow and gives me the wits and keen eyes needed to pursue my quarries, both on the hunt and off. By bearing Andruil's markings, I am sworn above others to uphold the Virtanadal, the way of the three trees. The way of the three trees? The human queried curiously. Mila nodded and thrust out one arm. First, Virasan, the way of the arrow. Fly straight and do not waver. Second, and at this she added her other arm, spread apart to suggest holding a bow, Vir Borasan, the way of the bow. Bend but never break. Third, and here she turned her palms up and spread her arms wide, Vir Adalin, the way of the forest. Together we are stronger than one. She dropped her arms. These are the ways that all Dalish live by. Wow, that is. The human seemed to be getting misty-eyed. Thank you. For sharing that, I mean. Mila nodded, though she had the distinct feeling that she should be thanking the human, as absurd a notion as that was. If you wish, you may approach now. I will not retreat from you. Oh, right. She flushed and knelt down, hesitantly reaching out to touch Mila's injured leg. While the warm itchiness of healing magic rushed through her, soothing more than the leg, to be honest, a familiar voice spoke up. Wow, Alistair whistled, and Mila was startled to find that everyone was still staring at them. Felicity, just so you know, you got her to say more words just now than I think I've ever heard from her combined. That was awesome. The male Durgenlen looked incredulous. I can't believe we found someone who can actually tolerate the mage's nosy nattering. The herbalist, Felicity, finished healing Mila's leg. The Dalish inspected it, it was as good as new, and stood up. Her face was flushed. I'll have you know I'm not nosy, merely curious. It's not a sin to seek knowledge of things you don't understand. I would agree, Mila said. When Felicity smiled at her in gratitude, Mila nodded. Still, bravo. Alistair turned his lopsided grin to Mila, like they were friends or something. So why didn't you just share any of that before? Mila felt the barest of smirks flit across her face, but that alone was enough to make the blonde warden goggle. Simple, Shemlin. She turned and started away, content now to return to her hunting. You never asked. 17 fetch. So what do you think his story is, eh? Finian stumbled over a root and nearly fell into a ravine, but caught himself against a tree. Give him a busy market full of merchant stalls and running kids, and he was nimble as any given acrobat, but stick him in a forest, and he became more prone to falls than she and he after one too many drinks. Whose? He asked distractedly. The nobles. Davith, on the other hand, navigated the woods like he'd been born here. According to him, that wasn't far off the mark. Finian glanced up at the human between watching his steps on the muddy earth. You think he's a noble? Don't you? Davith glanced back, smirking. I'd think someone of your talents would be able to smell it on him, same as me. He's just got that. I got me a right heavy purse, quality. Finian snorted. I don't do much smelling. Learned better than to use my nose, growing up in Denerim. Davith laughed. Me, I work with words. A guy says hello to me, and I'll be able to tell his temperament, his motivations, his mother's first name, and his favorite kind of Orleans pastry. But Percival doesn't talk, so, alas, it seems I will never know whether he prefers croissants or cream puffs. Davith chuckled as he skirted them around a rock fall. The two were out hunting in the woods, trying to catch dinner. Or rather, Davith was hunting. He had 2 rabbits already swinging from his belt, while Finian fumbled about with his new short bow in a way that may have been considered shooting if one were blind, drunk, and had never seen a bow before. Finian's new leather armor kept creaking, too, and he found that disconcerting. He was used to passing through thick crowds, completely unseen and unheard. A creaky armor-wearing bow-wielding elf was very likely to draw attention. At least he still had his daggers at his wrists, though Duncan had stopped at the last town to have a proper pair of wrist sheaths fashioned for him, complete with a spring mechanism that made them pop out when he needed them. The sheaths were small and unobtrusive enough to fit under a reasonably loose shirt, too. Duncan would have had to order that special, to make that work, as if he knew Finn would need to be secretly armed while in plain clothes in the future. Duncan played all cool and unassuming, but he was wily when he needed to be. As they walked, looking for game to stir up, Finian's mind turned toward their 4th companion. Percival did sort of have that noble look to him, Finn supposed. His equipment was certainly nice enough, and that crest on his shield was one Finian had seen before, on the liveries of some servants who worked the various Denerim noble estates. Thing was, Finian couldn't name which crest that was. The pickpocket had never really bothered to pay attention to the differences between the nobility. He tended to chalk them up as being cut from the same wealthy, arrogant, casually racist stock. Then again, he knew from personal experience that some nobles could be much, much worse. You've gone a bit quiet, friend. You all right? Finian shook his head to clear it. Yeah. Just trying to think, and that's hard enough for me without navigating a forest while doing it. Oh, wait, are we navigating now? Honest, I was just walking us around in circles. Finian laughed and threw a rock at the human. It bounced off his leather pauldron. Oh, you got me, you did. Davith made to stumble forward, clutching his shoulder with an over-empathetic groan. I'll never be able to shoot a bow again. Actually, I think I'm dying. Davith collapsed on the ground with a cry of oh woe. Finian doubled over laughing. At least my death was by a mighty foe, slain by a foul rock beastie. Davith fell limp in the dirt, letting his tongue loll out for good measure. Finian managed to collect himself. Grinning, he nudged Davith in the ribs with his boot. Davith cracked an eye open. What do you think? Too much. I think, you just scared off all the game with your awful acting. What? No encore, eh? He chuckled and sat up, dusting himself off. Just as well. I'm right sick of rabbit stew for dinner. You prefer biscuits and jerky. Finian helped pull Davith to his feet. Then it sounds like the army's the right place for you to be headed. Cripes, the army. Davith shook his head to himself as they started back to their camp. It was getting pretty close to sunset anyway, so they would have had to turn back soon as it was. Can you believe you and me are going to be in the bloody army? How in Andraste's armpit did that happen? The question is, does it say less about us, or about Duncan for recruiting us? Davith laughed. Fair bet you don't want to mention that to him, eh? I might, just to see his reaction. All I can say is be careful. That old bugger's a fair bit faster than he looks. Bet he knows how to wield those blades on his back, you mark me. That's me, tempting fate with tongue wagging. Finian slipped down a sandy slope, but recovered at the bottom without actually having fallen down. A fair bit of fancy footwork on his part, if he did say so himself. Davith laughed as he took a slightly rockier path to avoid the sand. You know what I think the problem is? You're too bloody light. I don't know if it's because you're an elf or what, but your feet just seem to fall lighter. Makes the ground keep trying to fly out from under you. Huh. And to think, usually it works to my advantage. What, being light-footed or being an elf? Finian laughed. You're obviously not an elf, asking a question like that. This made his companion grow more somber. That bad, is it? And that sucked all the fun from the atmosphere. Finian tried to keep it light. It's not so bad, as long as you learn to come and fetch when told. And if you're real good, sometimes you get a cookie. Davith shifted uncomfortably as they walked, and Finian poked him in the side. You don't seem to mind, though. After what I saw you pull with the sergeant back in Denerim. I'd have been right out of it to mind. Davith cast him a self-depreciating smile. I do admit, though. I was a bit surprised when Duncan recruited you. It hadn't really occurred to me at the time that an elf could be a Grey Warden, though it made sense once I'd thought about it. Why not, right? He glanced at Finn gauging his reaction and Finn smiled back to show he wasn't offended. Besides, you were rather covered in blood at the time, so who was I to argue? But if I hadn't been covered in blood, then you'd have let me have it, Davith seemed to be loosening up a bit. Finian was glad for it. He wasn't going to let a bit of shaky race relations get in the way of a potential friendship. Oh, you're right, I would have, Davith said. And Duncan too. Can't have a pickpocket better than me on the team, I would have told him. What would be the point of me cutting purses if you then just pickpocket the cut purses, eh? Oh, that does sound like a good system. Remind me to try that next time you cut Duncan's purse. You know, before he mows you down and cuts you into dozens of little Davith pieces. Davith laughed as they crossed through the last foliage into camp. Isn't that the truth? The warden commander himself was getting the evening's fire started in the clearing they'd found off the road. He raised an eyebrow as they joined him, as if wondering whether he dared to ask what they'd been talking about. Duncan seemed to find it more prudent not to get involved in their conversations, preservation of sanity and all that. Davith settled down next to Duncan to start preparing the rabbits. Finian, meanwhile, started digging through the saddlebags that had been dumped a little farther away from the fire pit. The mule they'd rented for the journey down to Ostagar was grazing lazily near the tree line. The fourth member of their party sat on an overturned log some distance from the fire pit, near the bags. As if Duncan had dumped him there at the same time he'd dropped the bags, which may not have been far from the truth. As usual, the human sat listlessly where he'd been set, staring at nothing and acknowledging no one. He ate when given food and followed directions well enough when setting up and taking down camp. But it was obvious his mind wasn't all there, and judging by the look in his eyes, wherever his mind was, it was a very dark place. Percival's gigantic dog, Hugo, sat next to him, always the stolid sentinel. In the past couple days since leaving Denerim, Finian had watched the dog, and noticed that it guarded its master like it might an injured littermate. It never left his side, even as it watched its surroundings with the attentive eyes that its master lacked. Davith's question came back to Finian, then. What was the man's story? What Finian had said was true, he had never heard the noble utter a single word. Even the names of both noble and hound had been provided by Duncan, so who was to say they were even correct? Finian had always had a curious mind, so the idea of such a mystery intrigued him. The dog was watching him, he realized. Those two smart eyes studied him just like he was studying them. Finian blinked, startled, and the dog quirked an ear. Almost like he was asking him a question. Just how smart was this dog? There had been mulberry hounds in Vaughn's estate. Finn worried if their deaths should weigh on his conscience too. Finian pulled their cooking gear out of the saddlebags. When he pulled out a wooden spoon, he saw the dog twitch out of the corner of his eye. He glanced up, and saw that Hugo was staring at the spoon intently, both his ears perked up. Then, the dog seemed to startle, and he looked back at his listless master. Slowly, his ears lowered again. The dog had been sitting loyally by his master's side for at least 2 days, maybe longer. He had to be restless by now. You want to play, boy? The dog's head snapped around, and he stood in excitement, but then he seemed to recall himself and sat back down. Finian waved the spoon around. I'm sure your master won't mind. The dog whined and looked at Percival again, and Finian realized that wasn't what he was worried about. You're worried about him, huh? Well, I'm sure Duncan will protect him for a couple minutes. Volunteering my services, are you? Duncan's voice sighed. I suppose one of the reasons I recruited you was your boldness. Finian stood and walked over to the dog. Hugo's tail wagged, and he watched the elf approach raptly. When Finn raised the spoon as if to throw, the dog jumped to his feet and barked happily. The spoon sailed off into the forest, and the dog went streaking after it. He returned a moment later, but not with the spoon. Instead, he'd grabbed a fallen branch that was at least half as long as Finian was tall. He laughed and did his best to heft the thing and toss it again. It didn't go far, but Hugo brought it back and he gave it another shot. By 4 throws in, Finian had perfected a technique that involved him spinning around in a circle and releasing the fallen branch mid-spin, sending it flying in a random direction. Between how often he fell to the ground, and the time he nearly clocked Davith with it, he had almost as much fun as the dog. Finally, as the sun was setting, the dog tired. Davith tossed the dog half a rabbit, which he happily devoured. Duncan ladled out stew for everyone, and Finian took a bowl over to the noble's listless form. Thank you. Finian nearly dropped the bowl. The voice was hoarse with disuse, and thick. The elf looked up and saw the noble's blue eyes looking at him, actually at him. Eye contact and all. For the first time, Finian was struck by just how arresting those clear blue eyes were, and how, when he wasn't staring off listlessly into space, Percival was quite handsome, in a golden, chiseled by the maker himself way. However, that was, as ever, a thought best kept to himself. You're welcome, of course. Finian cracked a smile, trying to be encouraging to this new development, despite how his heart raced. Can't have you starving before you've put at least one darkspawn away. Not that. His hand reached out and tangled his fingers in the fur behind Hugo's ears. I've been unfair to him. Thank you. Davith was right, the man certainly had an aristocratic accent, though the cultured tone was marred by its emptiness. His tone was low and dead, handling speaking like one would a fine crystal ball, as if were he to inject any emotion into it, everything would crack and shatter. She and he had sounded a little like that, when she'd been fighting back tears. Finian just held the bowl out to the noble, keeping the warm smile on his face despite the empathetic pain that twisted his gut. It's no trouble. Guarding you is hard work, I suspect. I figured he could use a break. The dog barked in agreement, and the darkness in Percival's eyes became perhaps a bit less all-encompassing. Then, the noble took the bowl and looked away, and he was gone again. Finian watched the noble eat for a minute, just to make sure he did, and then headed back to the fire. He sat down, and Davith handed him a bowl of his own. As soon as he'd settled, Duncan sat down beside him and put a hand on his shoulder. I suspect that I should thank you as well. The commander smiled down at him softly, then nodded back in the noble's direction. He will need a shoulder to lean on in the coming days. I would hate to lose one of such skill to his own grief. So it's grief, then? Davith asked softly. For who? Who did he lose? Duncan shook his head. I'm afraid it is not my business to say, although I suspect the both of you will find out soon enough. He stood. Eat up. We've got a long road yet to Ostagar. 18 A good army gives its prisoners shirts. So why do you suppose we're to be confined to the king's camp? The other three weren't asking the question, and Felicity was never the one to let a question remain unasked. I wouldn't say confined, exactly, Alistair hedged. Do you think it has something to do with that, tantrum the elf threw last night? Ser Jory asked, then turned to Felicity. Is he always like that? His temper was rather infamous back in the circle, she said somewhat wryly. In front of them, Marnan remained quiet as she led them in their tour around the king's camp. She seemed to be too busy studying the fortifications and making mental notes of supplies to attend to the conversation. Felicity wasn't clear on why or how, but it was obvious the dwarf had experience with pitched combat. It was more than could be said for the rest of them. Really, Alistair should probably have been leading the four of them, being the Grey Warden and all, but he seemed content to escort from second rank, as it were. I know what it looks like, but it's really nothing to do with, what was his name? Khazar. Alistair shrugged and scratched his chin. Though the way he glares at me, I wouldn't mind it if someone decided to put him in timeout for a while. Hopefully before he decides he wants to see what a roasted ex-Templar looks like. Felicity held her tongue at that. Sometimes, she forgot that the amiable warden had Templar training, it hadn't come up much in the 3 days since their arrival. Khazar, though, she suspected that after what had happened at the tower, he had a much more difficult time dismissing it. Given that, she couldn't say she blamed him for his hostility toward anyone connected to the order. By the Maker, was she feeling sympathy for Khazar Sirana? So what would you call it, Warden? For the 100th time, Ser Jory, call me Alistair. It is my name, after all, and a damn good if I do say so myself. The blonde sighed. All I really know is that a letter from Duncan arrived this morning by courier. Apparently, he's left Denerim and is on his way here. As such, he would like all recruits kept to the king's camp. Knowing him, it's probably just so, when he finally does come in, he can collect you all quickly without having to scour the army camps from walls to washrooms. If that's the case, Jory said, someone should tell that Dalish elf. If you want to go find her and tell her, Ser Jory, be my guest. You mean go out in the wilds? Are we even allowed to do that? Actually, no. I don't think so. Alistair frowned. I wonder how she keeps getting out. That was another matter that had been pressing on Felicity's mind lately. While healing Mila's leg the day before, Felicity had felt something strange in the Dalish elf. Something dark and twisted, spreading through her like drops of black oil in a bowl of clear water. She hadn't been able to identify it, and the Dalish elf had disappeared as soon as she had been healed. As of yet, Mila had not returned. Oh, she hoped the Dalish elf did not stay out in the Korkari wilds with that seething around inside her. You have not been sentenced. Marnan's outraged voice snapped Felicity from her thoughts. She looked up in time to see the dwarf turning to a guard minding a set of hanging cages. Just what kind of army are you running here? The guard shrugged. Not my fault. I suppose the higher UPS have more important things to do than worry about some deserter. The other three moved up to stand next to the dwarf. Felicity noted that one of the hanging cages was occupied with a gaunt, nearly naked man. That certainly couldn't be healthy, as wet and cold as this area was this time of year. Marnan frowned, crossing her arms. He's a deserter, then. I wasn't deserting. The prisoner spoke up, pressing against the bars of his cage. He looked around at the other three pleadingly. Does it matter? Please, all I want is some food and water. Marnan cast a disapproving look at the prisoner. Where I come from, deserters are cast out into the deep roads. Alistair and Ser Jory looked confused by the reference. Felicity, however, only sighed and started digging around in her belt pouch for the half-eaten tack bread she'd stored there this morning. And you don't think that's a little extreme, Marnan? Of course not. The dwarf seemed shocked that Felicity would even question it. When you are fighting darkspawn every day of your life, you need your army to stand together, bravely facing their own deaths with conviction and courage. Deserters undermine that, and undermining morale can be absolutely disastrous when you are facing impossible odds. Is that what fighting darkspawn is like? Ser Jory asked. Impossible odds. Not impossible, Sir Jory, Alistair assured him. Bloody unlikely, but they still die when stabbed well enough. Still, Felicity said, finding her half-loaf of bread. Starving him is an unnecessary cruelty. She handed the loaf of bread through the bars. Oh, thank you. Thank you. The prisoner said, devouring it hungrily. Felicity followed the bread with her waterskin. He drained it. It wouldn't hurt to give him a shirt as well, she told the guard. The guard snorted in annoyance. And where am I supposed to get a shirt, huh? No one gives me nothing. Alistair smirked at Felicity. Not a fan of half-naked men, are you? She blushed. He'll catch a cold like this. Dampness and cold makes one highly susceptible to all manner of diseases. It's even worse if he doesn't have a proper chance to tend to his own hygiene, which only allows diseases to. All right, all right. Alistair laughed and started unbuckling his cuirass. Naked man bad, we get it. Once the cuirass was off, he tugged off his undershirt and rolled it into a wad, pushing it through the bars. You are all very kind, the prisoner stuttered, fumbling with the cloth. Alistair shrugged and grinned. I just didn't want to listen to her talk about it for 10 minutes. He turned to wink at Felicity, and she felt her face go hot as she noticed just how broad and strong-looking his bare chest was. Coupled with that devilish wink, it left her vexingly tongue-tied. Marnan spoke to the prisoner then. We'll see whether we can't find someone to sentence you. That will at least have this finished, one way or another. Thank you. You all have my gratitude, for what that's worth. None would be needed, if your imprisonment were being addressed properly, Marnan sighed. Even so, you're welcome. Right, Felicity. What? Felicity tore her eyes away from Alistair, who was gathering up his splint mail, but making no move whatsoever to put it back on like he should. She blinked, gathering her wits. Yes, of course. Felicity followed as Marnan led them away, down a pair of stone steps to a broader section of the ruin. That was the right thing to do, I think, Sir Jory said as they walked. Giving him a little dignity, I mean. And food, Alistair chuckled. The food probably helps too. He must have a family somewhere, Jory said. A wife, or siblings, or something. I'm sure they would have appreciated what you all just did. Never really thought about that, said Alistair. I know I would have. I have a wife, you know. And a child on the way. I'd have hated to have wasted away like that, each day knowing they'd never hear from me again. I agree, Marnan said from up front. Far better to die with honor, facing the dark spawn, than to die curled up in some cage. Her voice softened. It is why my people exile some criminals to the deep roads. Alistair raised a hand. I'm a fan of not dying at all. While they were crossing the camp, Felicity spotted a familiar set of maroon robes. Her heart did a leap, and she hurried forward. When? The senior enchanter looked up from the book she had been reading. As Felicity came to a stop beside her bench, Wynn's wizened face crinkled into a welcoming smile and she gently closed her book. Felicity. I had wondered when you might find me. I hear word from the tower that congratulations are in order, for both of you. Thank you, Wynn. Felicity couldn't seem to tamp down her elated grin at seeing her former mentor again. She could hear the others coming up behind her, and she couldn't bear to embarrass herself. I've been practicing creation magic, it's just as you said, it's gotten much easier. That is good to hear. The older mage glanced behind Felicity. And who are your friends, my dear? Other warden recruits. Felicity turned herself to point to each in turn. This is Marnan, and Sir Jory. And Alistair is the Grey Warden who's been tasked with supervising us. Alistair chuckled. You make it sound like it's against my will. Is it not? Marnan asked with a grin. Well, yes. But she doesn't need to know that. Well met, Wynn chuckled. I am Wynn, a senior enchanter of the Circle of Mages. Wynn turned back to Felicity. It is good to see you getting along so well with your new companions, Felicity. The others wouldn't have caught it, but there was relief in Wynn's voice. Wynn knew well that Felicity had never been particularly adept at making friends with her peers. Tell me, how is Khazar faring? I'd heard something about a disturbance in the general camp last night. Felicity rolled her eyes. Oh, yes. That was him. He met a Dalish elf that looked at him sideways, and so he decided to shatter all of the practice dummies in the West Hills camp. I see. Wynne said calmly, though Felicity swore the elder woman was holding back laughter. It did make a very pretty light show, Alistair put in. Let's hope he shows so much enthusiasm against the Darkspawn, Marnan said. Well, that won't be a problem, the blonde replied. Just have Mila glare at him again, and make sure the archdemon is in his general vicinity. That should about stop the blight right there. Actually, Wynne, Felicity said when reminded of Mila. I wanted to talk to you about something. Go ahead. I'm listening. One of the other recruits is a Dalish elf. Yesterday, I healed her for a leg wound, but there was something else wrapped around her like moss on a stone. Ah, yes. I believe I have seen the elf you're speaking of. Unfortunately, I haven't had any opportunity to examine her closely, so I can't say what might be ailing her. I can. Both mages turned to Alistair in surprise. He shifted uncomfortably, raising the armor in his arms to cover his torso, as if suddenly realizing he was still shirtless. Though I don't know if I should. Please, Alistair, Felicity said. The enchanter is a healer, much better than I am. Maybe she can help. He shook his head, his lips thinning. Trust me, what Mila's got, no magical healing can help. Wynne made a sound of understanding. It's the taint, then. The warden nodded. Felicity felt her stomach flip. But how is that possible? She doesn't seem all that affected, she's not showing the standard symptoms, from what I can tell, no weakness, or pain. Just yesterday, she purportedly took down a boar and brought it back to camp single-handed. Oh, she's showing it, Alistair said grimly. When she first came to camp a month ago, she was a great deal quicker, and stronger. More stubborn, too, though I know that's hard to believe. A month. She's had the taint for a month. How is she even still alive? That, Wynne said ponderously, is a very good question. Alistair just shrugged. All I know is that Duncan took her from the Dalish when she got sick, because the only cure for the taint is to become a Grey Warden. That seems odd, Ser Jory said with a frown. What about being a Grey Warden cures the taint? Felicity rolled her eyes. Grey Wardens are immune to it. You're to become one, and you don't know that. That's how we can defeat the Darkspawn, then, Marnan said wryly. Just induct everyone in Ferelden into the Grey Wardens, and suddenly no one gets sick from their blood. That would be one massive problem solved right there. Alistair returned the wry look. If only it were that simple. Well, Felicity said, why isn't it? If we're facing a potential blight, and Grey Wardens have an advantage over non-Wardens, why not induct the entire army into the Wardens and give them every advantage possible? Look, there's some things I'm not allowed to tell you, all right? But let's just say that the joining ritual is not exactly the sort of thing you want to inflict on people who aren't absolutely dedicated to wiping out the Darkspawn. Alistair rubbed the back of his head, nervously. It's why Duncan has to be picky with his recruits. I think this is the largest wave of new recruits the Ferelden Wardens have had in a century, and that's just because there is a blight on the way. Wait, go back, Ser Jory said nervously. A joining ritual? That sounds like another test. Have we not already had enough of those? Felicity turned to him. Does the prospect of magic worry you, Ser Jory? No, it's not that. I just thought. I mean, haven't we already proven our worthiness? How many tests do we have? Marnan eyed him coolly, obviously not approving of his attitude. As many as are necessary. The Grey Wardens know what they're doing when it comes to the Darkspawn. If you're worried about tests, Felicity said, all you need to do is study. I happen to be very good at tests myself, so I can tell you it's all about preparation and self-confidence. A wise lesson, dear, Wynne said with a smile. One that, I think, applies to many aspects of life. Ser Jory nodded, his lips pursed. Meanwhile, Alistair chuckled. Feels like I'm back in school, all right. Felicity couldn't really imagine why that would be a bad thing. 19, just an elf. And now there were Templars here. As if he could hate this camp any more than he already did. Khazar could feel them watching him as he wandered the king's camp alone, and the weight of their stares made heat prickle up and down his spine. Word of what had happened at the tower must have gotten back to them, to make them watch him as unwaveringly as they did while he passed. Only his own assurances that they could no longer touch him kept him from exploding right there, though whether in rage or gibbering fear was up for debate. He just couldn't shake the memory of Grigor's hand on the back of his neck, somehow pulling all the magic from his body and blocking his connection to the Fade. To him, being left bereft of his magic was absolutely terrifying. Without it, he was just an elf. He'd never really thought of his race before. At the tower, he'd always just been Khazar Sirana, Irving's favorite apprentice and mage not to be trifled with if you valued keeping certain parts from being frozen off. But here, ugh. Here, no one knew about his exceptional talents or his reputation. Here, he was the elf. As in, when someone didn't know his name, they called him the elf. As in, hey, elf. Fetch my quiver, would you? Or, you're the elf Duncan recruited, or, what's it like being an elf at the tower? Elf, 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 elf. As if that was some important, defining feature, or something. It was just the shape of his ears, for the Fade's sake. And then that other elf had walked into camp, all proud of her heritage and speaking of things that Khazar had a feeling he should understand. And he hadn't. And he had sort of wanted to. Why did he care? He wasn't like other elves, who scraped livings together being walked on by Ferelden's upstanding nobility. He was a mage, and a powerful one. He didn't need some stupid list of gods or codes of conduct or sense of kinship. He'd never needed any such thing before. So, why did the Dalish's obvious rejection of him hurt so much? Hey, elf. Where's that armor I requested? Khazar whirled, lightning coming unbidden to his hands. Do I look like a servant to you? The tall, balding man who had addressed him backed up, eyes widening. Whoa, sorry. Didn't mean anything by it. I just thought that I was an elf, so obviously I must exist to do your bidding? Wrong. Khazar released the electricity building around him at a nearby crate, destroying it and its contents. Then, he whirled and stalked off. He could see that a pair of nearby Templars had put their hands on their swords, but he just glared at them and they made no move toward him. I'll give ya one thing, elf, a low, rumbling chuckle sounded from nearby. Watchin' you is sure as a prince's ball's a lot more entertaining than watchin' any of the other sticklers here. Khazar whirled at the voice, because if one more person called him elf, just one. Garrod hopped off the base of a ruined statue. He'd been sitting there, apparently, though Khazar would never have guessed it a moment ago. The shadows had an eerie way of blending into the dwarf's skin, it made him hard to spot if he didn't move too much. Easy, kid. I've been called Brand and Duster all my life. The dwarf tapped the curving tattoo on his cheek. I know better than anyone here how frustrating it can be. So stop pointing that thing at me, huh? Belatedly, Khazar realized he'd been nursing a lightning bolt in his hand. With some effort, given his agitation, he let it dissipate. Then why did you do it just now? Khazar snapped. A toothy grin crossed the dwarf's face. Like I said. You're entertaining. Khazar made a noise between a scoff and a growl. Then, he spun on his heel and continued his exploration of the king's camp. Garrod fell into step beside him. I notice how those chantry tin cans watch you. Not too fond of ya, are they? The feeling's mutual. Then would ya like to have a little fun with em? Khazar stopped, turning curiously at the dark humor in the dwarf's voice. What do you mean by fun? The dwarf shrugged casually, though the smirk on his face was far from innocent. Nothing permanent, of course. But wouldn't it be funny if, sometime around dinner, they started to feel real woozy? Too woozy to harass any young mages who are minding their own business, of course. Khazar was intrigued. And how would this come about, exactly? Garrod laughed and pulled a vial out of one of the pouches at his belt. Why, how do ya think? He twirled the vial around his fingers and smirked. My own special brand of magic. Grinning himself, Khazar followed Garrot as the dwarf led them through camp, toward the Templars' mess tent. Perhaps there was a silver lining to having the Templars here, after all. 20 A royal welcome. When they rounded a bend in the hillside and Ostagar finally came into view, Percival could do little but stare. The ruin had been a fortress once, grand and impenetrable. Now, it was cracked and tumbled in several places, the walls marred by both age and battle. Percy wondered whether an ally of the presiding lord had ever taken the fortress from the inside. Fergus would be somewhere within those walls, unaware of what had happened in Highever. By the Maker, Fergus had lost more than just parents to Howe's treachery. He'd lost a wife. And a son. Percival's mind flashed back to the memory of his mother weeping over the corpses, the first they'd found of many. The image was burned into his soul, bleeding his heart of emotion that had long since drained. He'd never get to teach his nephew sword work now, or, when he got older, sneak behind Fergus's back to show him the ways of women. Orin was now nothing but a ghost left to haunt the halls of the castle Cousland. He wanted to weep, but he'd wept all the tears he had over the course of that first awful night. Now, there was only a vast, cold pit in his soul where there had once been warmth and happiness. Come on, a soft voice said, and Percival registered that the elf was standing in front of him, gently taking his arm to lead him forward. The journey's almost done, and if Davith doesn't get a bath soon, I'm going to push him into the next lake I see. Ha! Came the other's voice from somewhere ahead. I'd like you see you try, you runt. Even if you managed it, you'd probably just slip and fall in after me, you would. Well. I do need a bath too. Percival tried to smile, he really did, but he couldn't seem to remember how. The elf had kept doing this on the journey south, including him in things and speaking with him as if Percival was capable of speaking back. It ignited a spark of warmth in his internal winter, knowing that he perhaps didn't have to carry the burden of his grief in isolation. It certainly helped keep his mind off it. Until, of course, Percival looked at Finian's smooth, expressive, very elven features and recalled all the elven corpses he'd had to step over. The Couslands had employed many elves as servants, most of whom Percy had known since he was a child. Like the cook's assistant who always filched him rolls when Percy snuck into the kitchen after bedtime. And the gardener who always grumbled when Hugo got into his flowers, but then promptly pulled him a berry crunch out of his pocket. And then, Maker, there had been Iona. The poor elven woman had made the grave mistake of picking Percival's bed on the night of the attack. No, wait, it had been Percival who had picked her. He was the seducer, the rake whose appetites had gotten the poor woman killed. If he'd only disciplined himself that one time, decided not to play that same blasted game, maybe she would have had a chance to escape. Or to hide. It had been his lust that had killed her, not the How arrow that had gone through her heart. Desire was just as deadly a demon as pride and sloth, it seemed. And he'd been a thrall to all three, then. Now, the only demon he knew was rage. Hugo's head butted anxiously into his thigh, and Percival sluggishly recalled his surroundings. While he'd been preoccupied, they had somehow walked the distance to the ruin, and were now passing through the gate. Stone arches curved overhead, the vestiges of an empire that had fallen a long time ago. Everything fell, and died, and decayed, it seemed. One day, there would be nothing left. No wonder the Maker had abandoned the world. Duncan was talking as he led them. Something about the strategic advantages of their position. Percy couldn't really attend to it. Whenever anyone spoke of battles, images would surface in his mind. His sword plunging into someone's flesh. The sting of an arrow grazing his arm. Sir Gilmore, standing battered and blood-splattered as he urged the Cousland matron and her wayward son to escape the scene of what would soon be a doomed battle. Percy hadn't even been afforded the closure of seeing the knight's body. Look at that tower, the elf said softly to Percival, drawing him out of himself again. I wonder if there's anything interesting in there. Do you think Duncan would let us explore it? I wouldn't count on finding anything, Davitha's voice called back. Been here for 1,000 years, hasn't it? That's an awful long time for the scavengers to pick through it. Duncan, ahead of them all, could be heard sighing, his lecture falling silent. Percival looked up at the indicated tower, but all he saw was more old stones. "Ho, Duncan!" A voice cried up ahead, one that rang a bell of familiarity strong enough to pull Percival out of his murk. Ahead, coming toward them, was a man with golden hair and a charismatic smile. Denerim. Percival had met Callan on occasion, of course, since their fathers had been so close. He ignored a stab of pain at that reminder. Percival had always been a bit dazzled by the man's sheer brightness. Everything about Callan was golden, and optimistic, and exciting. Growing up 12 years Callan's junior, Percival had always been somewhat in awe of the prince. And how the prince could spin a tale. Percy recalled hours spent with the other young nobles, listening to Callan tell grand tales of his father's accomplishments. They were certainly more interesting than any accounting Aldous had ever taught him, and then he'd seen Aldous, limp in the library, bleeding out over all his beloved books. No, focus. Percival had dueled Callan once, back when he'd still been Prince Callan. And Percy had won, much to his father's dismay. Callan, of course, had laughed and congratulated Percy on an outstanding duel. Duncan was talking to Callan, Percival realized. "If I can help it, Your Majesty. Then I'll have the mighty Duncan at my side in battle after all." Glorious. Percival felt his stomach twist. "In the meantime, the other wardens tell me you've found more recruits." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Allow me to introduce them to you." "No need for this one," Callan said laughingly, stepping up to Percival. The sun glinting off his golden armor was far too bright. "You are Bryce's youngest, are you not? Well, do I remember your sword pressed up against my throat? It will be wonderful to have you fighting at my side." Percival tried to think of something to say, but couldn't seem to find anything. "Tell me, how is your father faring? I'd expected him to arrive by now. I'd hate to have him miss the battle tomorrow." Percival swallowed and found some words. "Father will not be coming. He's dead." It had been the first time he'd acknowledged it aloud. Pain twisted a dagger in his chest, making it hard for him to breathe even as it stoked the burning anger that had been seething deep within him all this time. For the first time, Callan balked. "I heard nothing of this when your brother came in. What happened?" "Arl Rendon how?" Percival growled, feeling that fire burn up into the only real emotion he'd felt since his world had caved in. Rage. He embraced it, and it burst forth from him in the form of words. "He betrayed my father. Sent his men in to kill everyone, woman, child, dog, elf." His voice was rising with his anger. "He slaughtered the entire household like animals. How deserves nothing but the same mercy he afforded them." Brows knit in consternation, the king turned to the warden. "Duncan, is this true?" "Yes, Your Majesty," the commander replied gravely. "Arl Howe has shown himself to be a traitor and overtaken Highever Castle. Had we not escaped, he would have killed us and told you any story he wished." Callan turned away. "I can scarcely believe it. How could he think he would get away with such treachery?" The king turned back around, meeting Percival's eyes with conviction. "As soon as we are done here, I will turn my army north and bring Howe to justice, you have my word." "So long as Howe dies, Your Majesty," Percival said thickly. "He will hang, I assure you. I know that will not bring your family back, but Howe will not profit from this." The rage that had burned inside him cooled at the assurance, tampered down until it was undetectable. He could only nod his thanks. The king's face softened. "No doubt you wish to see your brother. Unfortunately, he and his men are scouting in the wilds. I am not eager to tell him." "About Oriana? Or Orin?" "No, I'd imagine not. Your brother will not return until after the battle is over. I apologize, but there's nothing more I can do." Percival simply nodded again. His father would have been horrified at how casual he was being about addressing the king, but he couldn't find the strength to do otherwise. The king glanced back at the ruin behind him, then turned to Duncan. "I'm sorry to cut this short, but I'm afraid I must return to my tent. Loghain waits eagerly to bore me with his strategies." He nodded to the rest of them with a somewhat reduced smile, and then turned. "Farewell, Grey Wardens." Duncan bowed his head respectfully as the king left. Percival was too drained by that conversation to so much as raise a hand in farewell. So they were going to concentrate on the battle with the Darkspawn. Of course they were, it was why everyone had amassed here. It was disheartening to see everyone here, concerned about other matters while Arlhow resided in Highever, sitting in his father's chair. How could he fight the Darkspawn, knowing the usurper lived off his family's coffers? But what could he do? It was out of his hands now. He had told the king, who would handle it once matters here were taken care of. Now, as he'd promised his father, he would become a Grey Warden. He knew, though, that his heart would not be in it. After all, he'd lost his heart back in Highever. "Blimey," said a voice softly behind him. "Your whole family?" Percival turned, recalling that there were more than just Duncan and himself present. The two thieves looked shocked by what they'd overheard, Davith stared with wide, appalled eyes, and Finian had turned 3 shades paler. "My whole family," Percy acknowledged tiredly. "And the guards. And the servants. And anyone connected to the Cousland name. Except my brother and me." Hugo butted his head against Percy's thigh with an anxious whine. Percy pressed his hand hard against Hugo's fur, gratefully drawing strength from his loyal hound's mutual experience. "Are you going to be okay?" the elf asked. Percival paused to consider that. Was he? He hadn't really considered the future, beyond the brooding wish to see House Lane. Surely, this emptiness inside him must abate sooner or later. What might fill it, he couldn't say, though he knew it wouldn't be what had been there before. "I'm not sure," he replied honestly. "But I'll be better. Eventually." The elf reached out and put a sympathetic hand on his arm, and Percival drew support from that as greedily as he had from Hugo. Anything to diminish the pain. "Tomorrow, the king's army will battle the Darkspawn horde," Duncan's voice cut in softly, and all 3 recruits, plus 1 dog, turned their attention to him. Despite the victories so far, they grow larger in number with each passing day. "We will need every man possible on the field. To that end, we should proceed with the joining ritual without delay." Finian's hand fell off Percival's arm as the elf said, "A hot meal might be nice, first." Duncan chuckled softly, much to everyone's shock. Duncan was not much for humor, after all. "I agree. We have until nightfall to begin the ritual, though some preparation is required, which must be begun soon." Duncan motioned for them to start moving again, and the recruits fell into step around him. "There is a Grey Warden in the camp by the name of Alistair. When you are ready, seek him out and tell him it's time to summon the other recruits. Hopefully, he will know where to find them all." He paused them at the edge of a long stone bridge that spanned a deep ravine. "In the meantime, I must attend to some business in the camp. You will find me at the Grey Warden tent when you are ready." With that, Duncan turned and started off down the bridge, presumably toward camp. Davith eyed the bridge dubiously, tapping his bow against the stones. "So do you think this old thing is safe?" Finian stepped out onto the bridge and quirked a grin, though it was a muted one. "Maybe not for you humans. But for a light-footed elf like me, it'll hold." "Oh, touché, elf. Got me there." Percival followed the pair as they started across the bridge. The thing had a couple holes in it, signs of battle, probably, which did make the integrity of it seem somewhat questionable. Thing was, Percival didn't much care anymore. If the Maker decided to strike him down where he stood, so be it. He'd accept such a fate, if it meant being with his family again. He paused partway down the bridge, though, as he took in the view. The Corcary Wilds stretched out in the distance, misty and unknown. His brother was out there somewhere, unaware of what he'd already lost. Or maybe he did know. Maybe Arlhow had planted assassins among Fergus's men as well, and now Fergus's corpse was rotting in a bog. Howe had arrived before Fergus had left, after all. Oh Maker, Percival really couldn't be the last living Cousland. He really couldn't be. Percival. Percy turned to face forward again, moving to catch up to the other two. They were waiting for him expectantly. Patiently, even. They were handling him with kid gloves, it seemed, but Percival couldn't say he blamed them. He had been rather delicate lately. Knowing they were aware of what had happened at Highever, even if none of them could do anything about it, eased his burden somewhat. The trio started off again, with Hugo's nails clicking against the stone behind them. So, elf, Davith began after a few steps. You don't suppose there are any good marks in camp, do you? With all the nobles running about and all. Well, sure, Finian replied. If you don't mind the fact that all of them will be heavily armored and armed. Right, that does make things a bit more interesting, doesn't it? Though, I'll tell you this from experience, there is nothing funnier than cutting the purse of some noble in heavy steel armor, and then watching him huff and puff as he tries to keep up with you. Even more fun than robbing most other nobles, it is. I am right here, you know, Percival said quietly. All three froze in surprise that he'd spoken without prompting, Percy himself the most of all. Well. Davith chuckled after a moment. Present company accepted, of course. I don't know. At this, Finian cast a sly smile back at Percy. We are both pretty good at what we do, and you, my lord, haven't been the most attentive. Who's to say that your pockets haven't already been picked? Percival felt a lightening of his features, very nearly a smile. Because Hugo would have bitten your hand off if you'd tried. He's a bit protective, like that. Ah, so to get to the master, I have to go through the dog first. The elf winked at the Mabari, who barked happily in response. I think I'm up to the task. For such a big, scary dog, Davith said. He's a bit of a soft touch, isn't he? Finian grinned. I bribe him with games of fetch. It works for me. We never did find that spoon. Percival looked out over the wilds again, half listening to his companion's banter. The pain in his heart had dimmed, and there was some warmth now nestled in that pit. Perhaps this would be what he needed, after all. A foe to fight and a family name to retake. Perhaps that would help focus this turmoil into something productive. Percival Cowsland, productive? A novel thought. He would have a purpose. He'd never really had one of those before. Other than to do whatever, and whoever, he damn well pleased, of course. For his father, he'd become a Grey Warden. For his father, and for Ferelden. But also, for himself. Provided Arlhow died a gory, painful death in the end, anyway. Check the description for the links to the author.